I just have to start the live stream before I put the slide up, so give me one moment. I just have to start the live stream before I put the slide up.
Great. Well, good morning. And Ariel, I heard a little feedback when you were talking. You repeated. It's like a second later.
Yes, I've closed the live stream window, so.
Oh, I see. Okay, great. Well, good morning to everybody. We're with our Eastern Oregon Solar Siting Rulemaking Advisory Committee. This is is it meeting number 9? Where are we at?
Yes.
Yes, meeting number 9. And thank you for everyone for joining us today. We've got just a couple slides to talk about how we get started today, our agenda and ground rules, and then we'll do a roll call of our RAC members that we have with us today. Our meeting just goes until 1 o'clock this afternoon, and the meeting is live streamed. And I'm Jamie Damon, and I am facilitating our meeting today. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So for RAC members, for participation, these are the same things we've always done, but it's just a good reminder to raise your hand to enter the queue to speak. You can use your raise the hand button at the bottom of the screen, which looks like a little, on a lot of our screens, it looks like a little heart now, but if you click on that, then it gives you a range of reactions, and one of those is a hand raise. If you're calling in by phone, you can press *9 on your phone to raise your hand. We ask that you lower your hand once you're done speaking. If you have any technical assistance requests, you can contact Ariella Dolan. Ariella, you want to just get off mute and come on and say hi?
Hi, everyone. Feel free to use the chat as well, or you can email me at adolan@kernswest.com.
Great. Thanks, Ariella. And for members of the public, we welcome any of you that are here today watching this live stream of our 9th RAC meeting. We ask that you refrain from sidebar conversations, and that means using the chat. So you can use the chat for if you have technical questions. Go to the next slide. We ask that you honor the agenda and participate actively and respectfully. Be mindful of your speaking time. There's a number, what do we have? We've got 23 participants today. So there's a lot of folks. And so just, you can ask other peoples to speak. You can raise your hand to speak. Just be mindful of how much time you're talking as well. Provide your name each time you speak. And it's also really helpful to hear your affiliation. I see a lot of you have that written in when you have your name on the screen, I see you have your affiliation there. You can change that by clicking on that. You can add your affiliation. If you didn't do that, it's nice for us to know who you're with. Be tough on the issues and soft on the people. Ask to learn, listen, and understand. And again, refrain from sidebar conversations, which in this case means in the chat. So use the chat if you're having a hard time engaging, or if you're having a technical issue. Otherwise, just talk with us. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. The desired outcome of today's meeting is to discuss and resolve outstanding sections of the rule. And just a reminder, we have this meeting and we have one more RAC meeting in January. We'll talk about that a little bit later towards the end of our meeting. But so we're really down to the wire in terms of finalizing language that we can support and making sure that we're having the conversations we need to have to get this rule over the finish line. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So our agenda, the way we've organized our time today is we'll do a roll call here in just a moment to see who we have here for our RAC members. And then we've got a few report outs. If you recall from our last RAC meeting there were a number of follow-up items that staff was going to be doing with Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, Oregon Water Resources Department, following up around historic archaeology and cultural resources, technical advisory committee, as well as we wanted to share with you any outcomes from the LCDC December 6th meeting. And then we also want to spend just a couple minutes on the maps that we did some updates to the maps. And you just want to walk through what those updates are and what the maps are telling us. So those are our report outs. And then we're going to focus in on draft language review. We're going to start with Division 33, 6, and 4. And in the packet that was sent out, there were some questions that John and his team have posed for the RAC members to consider. So hopefully you've had an opportunity to look at those questions and look at the language and come prepared today to talk with us about what your suggestions are. And we'll walk through those questions with the full RAC. And then we're going to take a little break. We'll come back and we'll take a look at Division 23, focusing on any of the outstanding sections. We've really spent most of our time talking about Division 23, and we have a lot of really great language that the group and our subgroup has crafted. So we're really mostly there, but there are a couple of outstanding sections we want to walk through, make sure that folks are on board. And then we've got some time at the end of the meeting to talk about our last RAC meeting that we'll be having in January and what our plan is for that meeting. And then talk a little bit about what will happen at the LCDC meeting on January 23rd and the 24th. And then we'll be done at 1. Any questions about how we've organized our time today? Any around what we have on the agenda? Or any other questions before we get started? Not seeing any hands. All right, let's go ahead and go to the next slide and we'll do a roll call of our RAC members. So this is the slide for our voting RAC members. And I see that there are folks in bold, and those are people that we understand are here today. So we'll start with those folks, and whoever I miss, you can jump in at the end and we'll make sure we hear from you as well. But before we move into our RAC members, John, can you introduce yourself and the DLCD team?
I can. I can get started anyway. I'm John Jennings. I'm the Community Services Specialist for the Department of Land Conservation Development, and have been involved in as lead staff, among others, in this work. And I will hand the baton to my manager, Gordon Howard.
Hello, I'm Gordon Howard. I'm the Community Services Manager with DLCD.
And I think we got Casaria Taylor.
Hello, good morning, everyone. Casaria Taylor. I'm the Senior Rules Coordinator for the agency.
And then I think I'll go to Adam.
Hey everybody, good morning. Sorry I was a couple minutes late. I got in at 2 a.m. last night from a delayed flight and had a tech issue just now. But DLCD Renewable Energy Planner, happy to see you guys here once again. I'll pass
And also, oh, I'm sorry, Adam. Good to have you back.
Yeah,
Late flights are a drag. I'd also invite LCDC Commissioner Mark Bennett. He's here, I know, if he wouldn't mind introducing himself.
And thank you for all the work that everyone's doing and the leadership, Gordon, John, and Adam, and the facilitation by Jamie. Just for information, I'll have to scoot out about 12:15, just so if I all of a sudden vanish, that's where I've left. So thank you.
Thank you. And Alexis is there.
Yep. Hey, folks. Good morning. Alexis Hammer, Legislative and Policy Manager in the Director's Office at DLCD. Thanks.
Great. Welcome, Alexis. Welcome, everyone. And Adam, I was just going to mention your sound is a little quiet. So you might want to adjust that. So let's move on to our RAC members. We'll start with Andrea. And Andrea, we're all wondering where you are this meeting.
I am home. I'm back in Portland. My picture, though, is in Spain, which is where I was for Thanksgiving. So yes, I'm here and I'm awake. You guys did very nicely put me to sleep last meeting. And of course, it was always right when it was like, oh, I want to hear this part. And I was out. But glad to be here.
Thank you. Welcome, Andrea. April?
Good morning, April Snow with the Oregon Water Resources Congress, representing irrigation districts and similar entities.
Hi, April. Bill?
Good morning, Bill Richardson, Senior Conservation Program Manager for the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation.
Welcome, Bill. Good to see you. Brandon?
Good morning, Brandon McMullen. I'm the Harney County Planning Director. It is County Court Day, so I have a couple things on the agenda. I'll be dipping in and out, so hopefully that's not too disruptive.
How was that potluck?
Delicious. It always is. There's some folks in the clerk's office who are master chefs, and they spoil us. It's one reason of many to work for a county and love it.
Nice. Damien?
Morning, folks. Damian Hall here on behalf of Oregon Solar and Storage Industries Association, or OSIA.
Welcome, Damien. Dan?
Good morning, folks. Dan Orzek here, Oregon Clean Power Co-op, and I don't know what it's like where you are, but here in Corvallis, it's like low 50s and sunny out, beautiful spring day.
Nice. Thanks, Dan. Dugan?
Hey everyone, Dugan Marab, Senior Associate of Regulatory Affairs here at Pine Gate Renewables, representing large-scale solar developers on the RAC.
Welcome, Dugan. Emily?
Good morning, everyone. Emily Griffith, Oregon Policy Manager with Renewable Northwest, and I am also coming in off of a delayed flight and trying to get back home right now, so I'll be on camera here in a bit. Thanks.
Welcome, Emily. Greg?
Good morning, Greg Corbin with Green Diamond Resource Company.
Nice. Good to see you, Greg. Kimberly?
Hi, good morning. Kim Petrie here with the Navy, representing the military in coordination with the Northwest DoD Regional Coordination Team. Thank you for having me.
Hi, Kim. Laura?
Good morning.
There you are.
Sorry, Laura Tabor, Climate Action Director with the Nature Conservancy.
Hi, Laura. Welcome. Mike Eng.
Good morning, everyone. I'm with Lost Team Firewise in Wallowa County.
Hi, Mike. Thad Eakin.
Sorry, I'm here. I'm on a phone call.
Welcome. Travis?
Travis Sellers, President of the Pendleton Building and Construction Trades Council. Thank you.
Welcome, Travis. Who did I miss? Not seeing anybody else. Let's move on to our resource members. Jeremy, are you here with us today?
I am. Good morning, everybody. Jeremy Thompson, Energy Coordinator, Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife.
Hi, Jeremy. Dan.
Hey, everybody. Dan Hubner, Oregon Department of Forestry. And I will just have to jump off at noon today, but I don't imagine that'll be a problem. I think I'll just be listening along.
Okay, welcome, Dan. Chad.
Hey, everybody. Chad Higgins, Oregon State University here. Happy Wednesday.
Hi, Chad. Good to see you. Did I miss anyone? Nope, looks like that's who we have. All right, let's go to our next slide. We'll start with our report outs. And Ariella, you can go ahead and take that slide down. Perfect. Thanks for that. So we had a number of follow-up items from our last meeting that John and his team were going to do. One was with Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. Another was with around cultural historic resources. Another was with the Oregon Water Resources Department. So John, where do you want to start?
Well, let's kind of start at the beginning, I guess, as we can find it. I want to say thanks to everybody again. It is a beautiful day here in Central Oregon, which is a departure from the weather we have been having. So I think it's going to be a great day and a great session. Hope everybody feels the same way. So we had an opportunity to speak with our colleagues at OEF&W, Jeremy Thompson, who had recently returned from some active field reconnaissance in Arizona, as well as Greg Jackal. And you may remember that Greg sat in at our last meeting. We wanted to talk about the kind of things that we had discussed as a RAC and make sure that they made sense and that our ODF&W colleagues understood them and that they made sense. And we think that they do. I think the upshot is that you may remember that we had talked about both the final location of wildlife habitat, as well as the final characterization being based on field surveys and done in coordination with ODF&W, as well as tying things a little more tightly with regard to mitigation to the statute in ORS 215-446 sub 3A, I think. And upon discussing it with ODF&W, I think they're comfortable with that, which is great. I don't want to speak too much for them. Jeremy, I'm going to ask you to jump in if I got that wrong. We also had chance to spend a little time. Adam and I spoke with Joe Kemper. Joe's a scientist with Oregon Water Resources Department. He was recommended by our director, Dr. Brenda Bateman. So we spoke. We didn't spend a lot of time. We didn't really need to. We talked with Joe for a bit. He kind of helped us. We didn't ask him to weigh in on the policy stuff, right? That wasn't something that it wasn't a request. We were more like, are we getting this language more or less correct? And I think that conversation helped us out. And this is really, we'll talk about in Division 23, when lands that may otherwise be ineligible could become eligible based on the water irrigation situation being confounded or challenged by a regulatory situation. We did not per se have a chance to speak directly with the majority of folks that we've been conversing on the cultural resources, historic archaeological resources, but we did have an internal conversation with our folks that have a deeper knowledge of those items. I really want to thank Max Yaklik for patiently kind of walking me through their perspective, Newson's perspective, and what is commonly occurs as part of an application. So those pieces, as well as us kind of studying so FSEC proposals, helped us come up with some language that we hope is an improvement over where we have been. It ties more directly and relies more heavily on the State Historic Preservation Office and the National Register of Historic Places, and where appropriate, local government and county programs. I don't know if there's a lot of county programs, but we wanted to recognize there could be. That kind of gets us to the LCDC meeting. It was on the 6th, I think, of December. Seems like a long time ago. We presented the commission with an update, which I felt was well received, and I'll invite Commissioner Bennett to share his thoughts here in a moment too. The commission was supportive of the RAC's a position of taking some more time. As you recall, that originally December 6th was to be the initial evidentiary hearing. But the commission felt it was a good idea to go ahead and afford some more time. The meeting really didn't have a lot of folks attending. We did have some comments, which we really appreciated, from Lisa Forrest with OSEA. Provided some, I think, good and on point comments that we appreciated. And that kind of takes us through those items, I think. Again, I'll go ahead and invite Commissioner Bennett to fill in anything I may have missed on the LCDC stuff, and if Adam has anything to add to the other pieces, this is probably time to do it. So go, Commissioner Bennett, if you don't mind.
Oh, John characterized it really well. The commission is really excited. They were most appreciative of the work that the DLCD staff had done in mapping, because that it was kind of taking somewhat an abstract concept and putting it on paper so you could see, well, okay, here's where, and how many potential sites and where the acreage would be. And then that did bring a good tie-in for the counties so they can take a look and see how comfortable they will feel. There was a short discussion that really was just a discussion on the opting in and the opting out, and that was more of a learning piece. My take from my colleagues is that no one really had a really hard position onto it at this point, and they were just trying to understand it better. Unless Gordon or John or Adam had a different take on that. So all in all, I would say the summary is, as John said, they're excited to get it, but they want to give the RAC adequate time to get it where the RAC is comfortable. There was the learning curve because unlike other RACs, this RAC has its own reporting responsibilities and requirements directly to the commission versus historically, traditionally, the other RACs go to the department and the department then moves it forward. So this one has some unique elements to it, and they were learning about that, asked a few questions, but it's wait and see with everybody pretty much on the we're good to go, and thanks for everybody's work.
And I'll just jump in and add briefly. We are working on getting a meeting with some of the experts at SHPO, the State Historic Preservation Office, on the cultural, historical, and archaeological stuff, and have that out to a lot of the tribal partners for feedback as well. So there'll probably be some minor revisions to that, but I do think we got it in a really solid place thanks to some help with some of our internal folks and from Max as well. And that's all I've got to add. John and Commissioner Bennett summed it up really well.
Great, John. So did you want to talk a little bit about the changes in the maps?
I do just real quickly, right? The maps have been updated and we've added slope as an exclusion factor. And unsurprisingly, that resulted in about 45%, almost half of the original figure being removed. And some counties, it's interesting, right? But probably shouldn't be a surprise. The counties that are more mountainous, or that have more prevalence of deep canyons, reflected that. So they, in those instances, some of those counties had a more severe reduction in acreages, so to speak, that could be potentially eligible. Counties that are more really kind of our desert counties, I think Lake County, for example, didn't have as much area removed. On the whole, I think across the board, it seemed like it was about half, 50-50, about half. I sent those information around. I attempted, I hope it worked. I hope it made sense. Rather than just send the maps themselves, I tried to portray them side by side before slope was included and after, to get a sense of what that really meant. And the also information about what that resulted in, and different figures for different counties in the whole. And I think the takeaway there, and I'll just to stop for now, was that originally, before we had accounted for slope, the number of potentially eligible. Now again, that's potentially eligible. There's things out there that we don't know about. We'll have to discover on a case-by-case basis that could affect that. We were at about 3.9 million acres, and after we counted for slope, we went down about 2.2 million. Again, those are soft numbers, because, as I mentioned, there are other things out there, and some of the way the configurations lay, as aren't necessarily conducive to any sort of development, including solar. So we would expect that those numbers to continue to drop, probably fairly dramatically, as they're refined and going through the final adjustments on a project specific basis or at a county level. So I'll just stop there. I'll be happy to try to answer any questions.
Yeah, I think that wraps up all the updates and report outs. So yeah, let's pause there and see what questions people have or comments around the whole suite of report outs and updates that you just did. So go ahead and raise your hand if you've got a question. Dugan, go ahead.
Not sure question. I mean, I really appreciate this mapping work, John. And I'm guessing the reason you didn't do updates for everyone was either a time constraint or just like with Lake County, it wouldn't have changed the original map that much, right? Okay, I'm seeing a nod. Just one thing I think for the larger group, I mean, as I look at some of these, and I think, related to the total acreage number, I think John's exactly right that there might be other things that come up. I think this was, some emblematic of what can happen sometimes when you add a new layer in. You can cut the land in half, and we're still looking at 2.2 million acres. I'm not acting like that's nothing, but I do think as we factor these things in, that number is going to get cut down dramatically in terms of what might actually be able to go through this rule. One other thing to think about, just that we think about at the solar developer perspective is also the aggregation of land, right? So if we're seeing these kind of thin strips of green on some of these maps, sometimes it's not advantageous to build like on a ridge line or something like, or whatever it may be. And so I think, just even as like someone who's thinking about trying to site something, I'm looking for those kind of larger blobs of green, because that's where, economically a project might be able to actually kind of site rather than kind of piecing together these little specks of green kind of dotted across the landscape. So I think if you're thinking about, another thing that's going to cut down this acreage, it might be wildlife stuff that's not mapped. It might be some of the other stuff that is either impossible, cultural resource or something else that's impossible to map now, or something like even subsurface, where some parts of the state, especially Central Oregon, have a lot of volcanic materials in the subsurface, which makes it, as John was saying, ineligible to build just because the expense of drilling on that land to put in racking posts. But also from my perspective, this aggregation point is also a limiting factor. So when thinking about that total acreage number, I would also factor in the idea of, we're not, if there's 5 acres here and then, half a mile away, there's another 2 acres, those aren't going to be a project, right? But if you can get one of these kind of blobs of green together, that's more likely to become, a usable area. I think that's intuitive for everyone, but I just want to make maybe it's very simple and I'm saying something everyone might recognize, but just wanted to make that point.
Yeah, thanks for that, Dugan. It's really helpful to understand how to operationalize the maps from a project perspective. So thanks for that. Mike?
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up with Dugan. If he had a sense of how much the geology or the substrate could impact these maps. You mentioned, basaltic rocks and the added expense of putting in piles. Do you have any sense of that, or is that another layer that could potentially be mapped? Do we have that in a data layer?
I'm not an expert on subsurface. I know in Oregon, it's more of an issue than what we see around the rest of the country, especially Eastern Oregon, in terms of it's usually an expense thing though. So it's a very project by project issue, because maybe, you're right next to the transmission line. You don't need to build, you can save money on other costs, and therefore the drilling and other kind of geotechnical work that you need to do to actually, get the piles into the ground is worth it. And other projects, it might not be as economic. So I think it's hard for us to do a hard and fast rule on also, it is, similar to the wildlife stuff, it is very project specific. And I guess I'm unaware if we have amazing data on the subsurface for all of Eastern Oregon, just in terms of creating some kind of layer related to that. But I think it's just another thing to add into your mind around, if a project is on the edge of profitability, something like subsurface conditions when it comes to driving those piles will maybe the make or break. When we're thinking about, I'm especially thinking around like, I think like Harney or Lake. Anyway, I wish Max was on here because I feel like he's also done a lot of this work and experienced it. But a lot of the solar developers out there, know the difficulty and cost that comes, which can increase those construction costs, I would say considerably. That is another limiting factor that maybe we haven't brought up as much on these calls, but is definitely something to consider when looking at that larger total possible number.
Do you see any technological innovations coming down the line that's being worked on that might facilitate impoundment of posting? I mean, using some of the screw technology or anything like that. Is that kind of imminent? Is that being worked on that might be able to address some of those substrate issues?
I guess I'm not so familiar with that. I do know there are several kind of lower impact styles of building where it's either almost like you lay the panel completely flat on the ground that has some desert applications that people are looking at, or some kind of like weighing each kind of panel down really close to the ground with, almost like a ballast or some kind of heavy material holding the panel in place. Those come with other issues. Mainly, if you're really close to the ground, you'll get a lot more dirt and soil on the panels and have to, use more water and clean them. So there's trade-offs with all of those, and also just the ability to produce a certain amount. With our tracking technologies and full racking, that might be harder to do if you have difficult subsurface conditions. That racking can increase production about 20%. The trackers that we use to track the sun throughout the day, that can increase production about 20%. And so, that's going to factor a lot into both the viability of the site, but also the project economics. So yeah, I don't know. I guess I'm going to say I don't know, but also I think some of those technologies have enough drawbacks that they're not really being widely considered. Most everyone, the standard, and maybe the way this group should be thinking about installations is, the standard right now is to drive piles and do single axis tracking on a kind of racking system. That's most of the systems you're going to see in Oregon being built now and then into the future is my understanding.
And Dugan, you had invited Max to weigh in, and Max is here with us now.
Oh, great.
Is there anything you want to add, Max?
Sorry, I missed the first part of the conversation, so I'm just catching up and not.
Max, I'll key you in. Just talking about, we're talking about the maps, and I was making a general point about, it's going to be with the green areas on the maps. We're going to want to talk about not things that are very separated, but things that can be kind of put together into a whole project. But then also one thing we haven't necessarily talked about a lot is subsurface conditions and how that might limit even development on some of these, least conflict areas. I don't know if you had any specific experience in certain parts of Eastern Oregon that kind of tells you about, how likely it is that some of these areas would be built on given, the challenges that come along with some of the volcanic, subsurface that we deal with.
Okay, sure. Yeah, I mean, some of those areas like in the northern part of Lake County are literal just rock. And so depending on the size of the transmission line, the size of the project, the cost of modules, all the inputs that go into project finance, that cost of drilling can kill the project essentially. Like technology is changing, there's new research and development, but having to drill into volcanic rock requires blasting essentially. So you have to drill holes and drop dynamite sometimes, which is incredibly expensive. So yeah, I think that's a good point, Dugan. And I don't know if it was addressed already, but just having looked through some of these maps this morning, like the one that jumped out to me was Morrow County, where even with slope, there's 55,000 acres potentially eligible, but the layouts of those areas are not buildable layouts because solar projects can't be built in along these lines, they need to be built in blocks. So I think there's probably also it's probably also true of maybe Sherman, a lot of the gorge counties where these green areas look like watersheds almost. And then there are likely other potential unmapped restrictions that further reduce probably pretty significantly some of the areas on this under the rule, not even accounting for the transmission capacity and planned build outs that we're aware of. So, a lot of the land in Harney County is just there's no transmission on those lines for construction. And then, unmapped things like cultural resources in Lake and Klamath County, um, the irrigation districts, although I know that that's partially dealt with in the rule. So yeah, I hope that is on point to this conversation, but I'll stop there.
Appreciate that, Max. We started saying the same thing, so I think we're aligned on that at least. But I think it's a good point to just say. I think John's exactly right. And I don't know if people think this larger 2.2 million number is good, bad, but we just want to set the expectation on how likely it is to be buildable. But thank you.
Yeah, and I guess the last thing that's in the developer's mind that's not readily apparent is that the distance from the POI, the point of interconnection, that's a real restriction on development. So like, looking at the Crook County map, there's all these areas in the north, kind of northeast of Prineville that will not be built because there's no pathway for a right of way to get from there back to the existing substations. Or, even in all the stuff on the east side, you have to cross the Crooked River, portions of which are wild and scenic. There's sage grouse out there. So that I acknowledge that those things are difficult to map and cannot be mapped and are not addressed under the rule. But just looking at this from the development perspective, there are these other real restrictions on what is actually developable under this from just a straight up kind of feasibility perspective.
So John, I'm wondering about, this conversation that Dugan and Max are adding these additional considerations that would be helpful as a part of a presentation to LCDC to have some of these additional considerations so people have a better idea of how to look at the maps.
I think that's a great call. We have had some level of understanding, about the complexities. That understanding has improved as we've heard from our partners and listened. I think our suspicion, would be at the end of the day, it might be 5 or 10% of the 2.2, that actually lends itself to having all the necessary features. And so, yeah, I think having a description to help the commission understand, would be probably pretty constructive for them. I see Mike's hand up, so I'll stop there.
Yeah, Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll postpone most of this discussion for subsequent to this, as we talked about. But I think that that might be one of the advantages of a dual use exemption of sorts in agrivoltaics, that that you probably have flat lands that are agricultural lands. And if we could, in the future come up with a system for that, I think that could incentivize and maybe free up some additional lands there if they are truly dedicated to dual use.
Thanks for that, Mike. Other questions or thoughts about the maps or the other updates that John and Adam have talked about, or any questions about the last LCDC meeting for Commissioner Bennett? Max, go ahead.
Thanks. John, I was just wondering if it's possible to make an effort to try to map some of these kind of like at least the ones that cannot be mitigated, like whether or not we can get some stuff from ODFW. Maybe this has already been done, but like, can we add are the sage grouse layers in there? I know there's preliminary maps of high use and very high use migration corridors that we could add. ODFW could probably give us a pretty good sense of where category 1 habitat is at. There may be some like obvious cultural resources areas that are not confidential that are, on the National Register of Historic Places that could be mapped. But I just wonder about whether there are some of these unmapped things, urban reserve areas that are definitely outside the scope of this rule that can be added just to get us a little bit closer to a sense of what is going to be allowed, either mitigated or unmitigated.
Well, I hope so, Max. So I think we had been initially we were going to try to do something along those lines, maybe not quite exactly, and then we found that it took more to get the slope data all put together than we thought that it would, and so that really kind of became the emphasis on this round. But I don't think we should feel like we're done yet, and to the extent that we can portray things that are relevant and helpful to understanding the whole picture, I don't think we would have any objections to trying to do that. Adam and I are probably going to talk to our person that does our GIS work later this week, and maybe we can kind of get together with folks. You guys can email us ideas, and we can kind of maybe try to see what's possible.
Mike?
Yeah, I've seen on some maps. I would think that attitude would also be an important factor. Which way it's orienting. If there is a slope, and I've seen that layer on certain GIS maps. So I think that something like that would be available. I don't know what the technical requirements are for developers, but obviously a southerly facing attitude is going to be much more desirable than something that's otherwise.
So I'm hearing some additional ideas around some data layers for the maps. So about making sure that we've got sage-grouse habitat mapped. If there are other sort of publicly known historic, cultural, archaeological resources that we're aware of that need to be mapped. What Mike just talked about around southern-facing slopes versus non, so that we know that those are more likely to be not slopes, but southern-facing
attitudes.
Yes, thank you. Those were some of what I heard.
And Cat 1, if that's possible, Jeremy.
Cat 1, thank you.
Max, reality is there's so little Cat 1. One, we don't have the layer, but two, outside, the only time we've ever really encountered Cat 1 on an energy project that I'm aware of is Washington ground squirrels. And those have to be a site specific. We can kind of guess where they're going to be, but not with great certainty. So I don't know that we're going to lose much ground trying to even guess where Cat 1 would be, because we really haven't seen that much of it.
And Jeremy, that's an example of what you could share in a consultation.
A lot of that's going to, if we're talking about really the realities we've seen in energy production in Oregon, Washington ground squirrel has been the Cat 1. With this, especially in the Columbia Basin. So those are site-specific surveys. If you've got intact sagebrush and good sandy soils, you're probably going to find Washington ground squirrels, so you can look at an aerial photo and guess. But that, that is going to take site-specific data collection to really get at those. And the nice thing about Washington ground squirrels, even though it's category 1, they're just little pockets typically, and it's an avoidance factor. So it doesn't preclude a project from being built. It's just an avoidance within project design. Anything else is probably going to pop on wetlands layer. I mean, that's the other one. If you had, some bogs, fens, ephemeral wetlands, some of those come up as Cat 1, but those are typically avoided in a wetlands delineation too.
Brandon?
There, I figured out how to unmute myself. I thought what I would just throw out there is maybe what could be a perspective from a planner as it relates to the use of these maps and maybe kind of looking at it, and in particular the ones we're discussing right now. And so that it's understood from my perspective that these are used to portray where prospective resources could be for the purposes of this project in this context, but it may not be so evident to elected officials that when they see something like this, that it doesn't automatically preclude something. So I just wanted to throw that out there, just for discussion purposes, just to say, hey, it would be the planner's job in a certain sense, along with maybe some help from DLCD on this stuff, to convey that if a county were to elect to go into this leg of this project and adopt not site specific but mapping, in this leg, this would be with the exception, like ODF and W data is ODF and W data, but with, say, slopes, for instance, to put together maps at a Eastern Oregon wide scale is to most likely use the best available wide data that you have. So I'm presuming that in order to put that elevation data together in a time frame that made the most sense, you had to use some very general elevation data in order to get there, which is totally understandable. So if you're a county looking at your own jurisdiction and you have some certain spots that may not look eligible based on what some of the mapping available to this particular project look like, you would have the opportunity to go through your own Go5 process and say, okay, we feel maybe it makes sense for us to take a harder look at this. We're going to obtain more site-specific data. And that's generally and again, I'm speaking to the choir. I see John nodding his head for sure. But for this RAC, it's important to know that planners do typically understand that when they're gathering data for something very specific and adopting new resource information, there's high level stuff that helps you get there and formulate where generally you feel your resources are. And then there's getting and drilling down into more site-specific areas that may or may not make sense at the beginning, but when you've got input from stakeholders, and in this context, solar developers, it makes sense to incorporate that best available data and to make a more refined decisions. So I just thought I would throw that out there as something to maybe think about contextually.
Thank you, Brandon. I think it's really helpful for the RAC to hear, from a planner on the ground about, these considerations and how this could work or additional steps and process steps. So that's really helpful. Other questions or comments related to the maps or the follow-up with ODFW or the LCDC meeting, since we have Commissioner Bennett here. Hey, Brandon, your hand is still up. Did you have another question or there you go.
Sorry.
Hi, Dan. No worries. Hi, Dan, I see you. Hey, Dan, you want to go ahead?
Sorry.
There you go.
Yeah, so following up on Michael's comment about the direction, the aspect of the slope, North Slope's obviously going to be out, but and I'll defer to Max and Dugan here on this, but typically the trackers run track east-west, which means they run north-south. So a south slope is probably not going to be advantageous, particularly advantageous. Flat's going to be best. Certainly north facing will be out pretty much.
Thanks for that. John, if I can lean on you and Jeremy for just a minute, because you did talk about that, and maybe we'll get into this when we look at the language, but if there's anything, I know that there was language in the Division 23 that folks were like, check with ODFW about that. And were there any changes in what came out of those conversations, or was it more of a, we're good to go, we got it?
I think it's more of the latter. Now, in response to what we heard as staff at the last meeting and in conjunction with the conversations, we made some adjustments, which we think represent where the RAC was at, and that seemed to be consistent with how our biologists are feeling. Hopefully I'm not mistaken there. So if Jeremy had anything to add there or anything, he could do that. But hopefully we've identified the areas of focus, principally, considering characterization, and tying things more tightly to the statute regarding mitigation. And that ODFW, and I think I said Jeremy nodded his head, thought those were reasonable and appropriate.
Jeremy, anything you want to add since we have you here with us today?
No, completely agree. No, I appreciate the collaboration. I think we've got that on the wildlife side at a point where we're comfortable with it, and I think we're meeting the goals that were laid out in front of us by the RAC.
All right. Well, if folks are ready, then, Max, go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, I guess just to kind of finish up the conversation on the maps, I wish when Rep Helm was giving his floor statement, he had said that the point of this rulemaking is to find viable locations for renewable energy. I think it's going to be very important for the commission to understand that, like, there may be green areas on here, but those may not be viable near-term projects that support the goal of reaching the clean energy targets in HB 2021. And I think this is the same pitfall that we saw with the BLM process, where there are these nice big blocks of stuff down in South Harney County that maybe are perfect and you can go get a permit on them, but the timeline to interconnect is like 10 years. And so I think I would like to hear from other members of the RAC on how they're feeling about these maps and numbers. I will speak for myself and likely would expect industry to agree that in our view, this is not permissive enough. And we've gotten to the stage in the rulemaking where we have to make some hard choices about where we want to provide more allowable development, because I think this is probably not going to get us there. So I'll look to other members of the RAC to weigh in on their thoughts on that statement. But my view is that, a lot of the development effort that's happening now is like in Sherman, Morrow, Umatilla, the north side, and we don't have any lands on these maps that look to me like they are developable in those areas.
Mark, go ahead.
Thank you. I agree with Max that that was one of the reasons why I pushed really also for maps, because having been through the sage grouse saga with John way many moons ago, the challenge in Harney, Baker, Malheur counties becomes really tantamount, because finding the lines and also having worked as the lead on the Boardman to Hemingway project, which still hasn't turned any dirt, knowing full well that it was going to take forever. I didn't want to, I really didn't want to see a package put together that the legislature looks at and go, oh, wow, here's all these sites. But you just can't get there from here kind of challenge. You have other things that come into play, conservation easements, which are now starting to come in on private lands, which block the opportunity for power lines. So there's a number of factors that limit this. And I think that by putting the mapping together, it gives the conclusion that Max brought up, and I think is an appropriate conclusion. Whether we can change the rules or should change the rules, that's probably totally a different discussion. But I think that we've got to be realistic as to the limiting factors out here, having spoken with a couple of the planning directors and said, if you had this, and they go, oh, I don't know how we'd ever get a power line to it.
So I think that kind of circles back to what Dugan was talking about, and then Max joined in around the additional considerations of what makes what needs to happen to make a good site. But then Max lays out a kind of a more challenging scenario, which is there a way, as we're looking at the map and we're looking at the rules, to entertain some more permissive standards at this point. So I think that's something that to think about as we're going through this final language. Are there areas that people would want to put something on the table now that you have a more complete understanding of what might be possible, given the combination of the language in the rule and what the maps are showing us. Damien?
Hey, yeah, just piggybacking off a couple of things that have been said. I think the maps are a very useful tool, but it should be thought of as are we on the right path as opposed to this is the state that we're going for. And because each one of these counties tells a different story, and there's a whole bunch of factors that go into it. But in the aggregate, it seems like there's not a whole lot of certainty in a lot of places about are we creating these viable projects? And the answer to the question of are we advancing towards the state renewable energy goals seems pretty uncertain. As far as just sort of data points and maybe framing up what the potential trade-offs are, there's a big, if you take the aggregate acreage number for potentially eligible areas, it looks like a big number. But I think in my mind, I would gladly trade a big number of potentially eligible acres for a smaller number of actually eligible acres that can create viable sites. And that would, I think, further the purpose of these rules.
Thanks for that, Damien. Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, it's kind of a placeholder question, but also just a point about, I think the folks that are going to be probably most familiar with what potential constraints there might be locally would be the counties themselves. And, if the counties, especially if the counties have a GIS department. And related to that is, I'm not sure, again, we've talked a little bit about it, about what the schedule and process is for presenting this to the counties. And I think, because so much of the successful implementation of these rules relies on the county's engagement and decision as to which path they want to take, and the practicality of that. I know we've always have a county commissioner, a county planner on the RAC, but there's a diversity of counties, and I'm just wondering if at some point whether DLCD is anticipating some Zoom presentations, perhaps to the county commissioners and the county planners, and at what point that would occur. It's going to obviously not be possible before it goes to LCDC, but I think it is important to not completely surprise them and seek some opportunities for them to provide some feedback. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that, Mike. John, I see you came off mute. You're just the guy I was going to ask about that.
I'll just take a second to follow up on Mike's point about working with the counties. We have been doing that to some degree. And when I say, I mean, we have appeared before the Association of Oregon County Planning Directors a couple of times, and we spoke to this issue, and we're helped with that by Mark Hudson and Emily Griffiths when we were at the Planners Network meeting in Baker City last spring. Seems like a long time ago, but we will continue that. I mean, it's a pretty common practice. I would expect that upon the adoption of these rules, we reach back out to the county planning directors to see if they would like, overview or summary at one of their meetings. We also have appeared before committees of the Association of Oregon County Planners, or excuse me, Association of Oregon Counties, which is the county commissioners. That's been a little while since we've done that. We participated along with ODF&W and Oregon Department of Energy presentation to a legislative subcommittee earlier this summer. So we'll continue to do that. I mean, those comments are right on point, Mike, and we would anticipate continuing on it.
And then thinking back to what Brandon said just a little bit ago from the county planner's perspective is that, it's difficult when you're putting together statewide rules and doing Eastern Oregon large scale mapping exercise to chunk it down to the scale that that every county can find as useful. And so the county could elect and probably would elect to do some additional work to figure out what sites might be viable. So so let me just wrap this piece up so we can move on to some of the language. So the outcomes of this conversation are that I think that there's some follow-up work to do with folks like Dugan, Damien, Max, Greg, potentially others around kind of a short list of some additional considerations that the commission and counties could be using to look at these maps to help them understand a little better about what makes a viable site. And so that they have good information about what these maps are conveying. So I think that's one follow-up piece. It sounds like we're good to go with ODFW with the language there, so I don't see any more follow-up there. And then I did hear that there's still some outstanding work to do around the historic, cultural, archaeological resources follow-up piece with the language around that. John, did you hear anything else?
That's consistent. I believe that's consistent with what I've got.
Okay, and then just following up on what Max said about, as we're going through this language and now that we have the maps as a tool, I mean, if there are opportunities there are places to allow some more permissive, allow more sites to be available. I think that it's incumbent on the folks on the RAC to point that out and say, well, here's a place that we might consider, and then the RAC can decide, if you want to have a conversation about that and what you might propose. So just be keeping that in the back of your head.
Yeah, thank you for that, Jamie. Yeah, absolutely. That feels to me like a conversation that we might explore a little more deliberately when we get to Division 23 stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess that's my feeling. And I also I don't think I can say it strongly enough, right? We are not presenting these maps as the definitive source, right? They're a helpful tool, we think, in this context. We do not believe that most of those acres identified would ultimately be, viable sites. And so that's how we're messaging it. And we absolutely believe that, as we graduate down to local level, that there should be, more focused improvements on those projects should they get there. So anyway, again, like I said, we went from 100,000 feet or so. Now we're at about 60,000 feet that we've added the slope data. We're still a pretty high level, right? It's still pretty coarse, and we believe that and understand that, and that's how we've been describing it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that for all Iraq here, I think that, given that we have this meeting and one more meeting left before we make a presentation to the commission about where you landed with your rules and your recommendation, if there are places in the rules where you can flag and say, this would be a spot where if we tweaked it this way or that way, it would allow for something, but we couldn't, as a RAC, get there in terms of recommending what that was. I think it would be really helpful to be able to highlight those areas for LCDC so that they're more informed as they're going through to say, okay, this would be a place or that would be a place that we could move things this way or that way to allow for something more to happen or for further restriction. So just be keeping that in the back of our minds as we go through this. What do you say, John? Shall we take a look at some language
I would love.
and go through some questions?
Yeah,
I
yeah.
know.
What I'd like to do, Jamie, if it's okay, I'd like to start with divisions 4 and 6
Yeah.
in that
Mhm.
order. Because I'm just afraid if we don't, we
I
may not get
agree.
to them. And I'm hopeful, if we all, including me, try to exercise some discipline, we can get through them pretty efficiently.
Yeah, that sounds good. And then just so everybody knows, and for folks who are watching online, if you go to page, let's see, it looks like it's page 3. In the beginning of the packet, right after the agenda, there is a section that says draft rules for RAC consideration. It starts with some specific questions. So if you look at Division 4, there's a specific question. This is something the RAC asked for at the last meeting, particularly Mike, we appreciate you bringing this up. It's like, hey, could you focus this in on what are the things that we need to pay attention to? So have that up on your screen or available as you're looking at it. And then Ariella, if you can put the rule on the screen so we can be looking at that. And so we're going to start with
Division
division.
6.
Yep, we want division 4.
You start with division 4, that'd be great. And then we'll move into that one. Yeah, great. There it is. So what we've got up here now, this is a different portion of Division 4 than we had the draft language before. You're kind of thinking about it and reflecting upon some of the comments. We think I realize this might be a better fit. This is the area of the rule that speaks to how you plan and zone exception areas. And that's really kind of the crux of the question in this context with this rule. It's just singular. So can we go down to the bottom, please? Just go and scroll all the way down. Yeah, there we go. So right there at the bottom there, lines 13 through 17. What this would do is a few things, we think, and we've observed that most frequently and certainly in current situations, when a applicant pursues an exception, and this is something different. This is outside of the Division 23 stuff. This would apply to one of the other options, with going ahead and considering going through the exceptions process, which we outlined in another area. But still, question: what do you do once you justify? You can have a larger site, something larger than the 12, 20, 320. but not triggering SEC review. What do you do? What do you zone it? We have seen a variety of approaches. We have seen people propose, a light industrial zone with a limited use overlay. Most commonly now, we've seen folks retain the resource zoning, retain the exclusive farm use zoning. We think settling the question and is providing direction. That is, in fact, what you do will provide guidance, and through that guidance will reduce confusion, and by that it will reduce risk. We hope. We also believe that, like I said, this is kind of codifying what has become, I think, a best practice. It also would ensure that some of the, I think we believe are important things, the siting types of standards, weed abatement and soil compaction, those things you've heard me talk about would apply. And also this feels like it's in line with, in keeping with the expectation that there could very well come a time when these go away, right? When they've reached the end of their useful life cycle. So retaining the EFU zoning or forest zoning would be in line with that. When they're returned back to the resource use, well, the zoning is there to meet it and help effectuate that. So that's our interest here. And so really the question for the RAC is that, does that make sense? Is this something we should do? We believe it'd be helpful. We believe it would be genuinely helpful. It's a small piece that we think could have kind of cast a large helpful shadow. But this is something that we really obviously need the RAC to opine on.
All right, so there's your opening. Mike likes it.
And I guess I'll just clarify, we're not voting on this right now.
It's
right. That'll come. But I just, I wanted to have the conversation, and really it'd be great. And Max, I see your hand up, but so I'll stop here in a second, but it'd be great to get a sense of where folks are feeling.
John, is there a corollary somewhere else in the draft related to addressing the issue in Silver Creek versus Marion County about which standards to apply in a mixed farm and forest?
Yes,
there is. Okay.
Well, so there's language, whether it's, I'm gonna rely on you and Damien probably to help us understand if it truly gets at those pieces. But we're proposing language, and we'll talk about it in 6 and 33, that talk about the using predominant use to determine what factors to use in a mixed farm forest zone.
Could you give a little more background, John, of where you've seen this be an issue?
So it hasn't come up very often. But I think there has been an open question in my mind. What do you do? Like we have seen, it was Jackson County solar project, which was appealed and led to some case law. That in that instance, they proposed to apply an industrial zone. Again, that project didn't get off the ground. But more commonly, we've seen, folks say, no, we're not going to change the zone. We're going to recognize probably through a plan, a policy that this site is eligible for larger size. We're elevating the size. So I think it helps answer that question. This is what in fact you do.
I see Andrea's hand up, so Andrea, go ahead, but unless you're going to take us down a different course.
No, I'm on this. I think that keeping the zone is really important from the agricultural end, because this is kind of like for lack of a better term, the bill of goods that the ag community is being sold on this is that this isn't a forever change. That if the solar sites go away, you can, you will be able to restore it to ag land. Well, if you change the zoning, that's not the case. So I think this is a very important factor to be consistent with what people are being told, that you're not forever losing the ag land.
Thanks, Andrea. Greg, go ahead.
Yeah, I would echo that on the forestry side and say that it would be very important to us that property that we made available for solar development would retain its underlying zone designation, and all of our agreements with developers are structured with that in mind and include obligations with respect to forest practices as they apply to the property and restoration of forest after the fact, et cetera, et cetera. And the vast majority of agreements that I'm aware of are the type of agreement that we have, which is a lease, an option to lease property for solar development, and it's time limited. It has a term associated with it, so that also makes sense. I could see an kind of a counter argument in a situation where the solar operator actually owned the underlying fee of the property, but I don't think that that's nearly as common.
All right, Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, I echo all of that. I think it is important because of the potential for restoration and reclamation for ag and forestry land. But I think also those two designation zoning types also provide opportunities and resource values just as open space. And I think that is, an important additional value of that type of zoning to be maintained over time.
Max, you're still in the queue with your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I don't necessarily disagree with anything that was just said, but I guess one of the things that's been said in the past is if you don't want a goal exception, you don't want to go through that process, then the solution to that is to change the zone. So if you are going that pathway, which I think is a legal and reasonable pathway to undertake, if you want to go through the headache of trying to change the zone of the underlying property to something like industrial that would, allow the project perhaps as an outright permitted use, there's still going to be an exception process, right, John? And that exception process is going to inquire what the exception is for and why you are changing it. So I fear that this language will create problems where a zone change is requested for good reason and the property owner is in agreement and whatever other justification there is, but the record will show that the zone change is based on the desire to place a facility there, and that this rule would prohibit that alternative pathway that currently exists under law that I don't agree should be removed.
Mark?
Yeah, I mean, two things. I mean, Max, I'm not sure I understand the objection because the language is very specific here to properties that have received an exception, right? Which, if you're talking about a zone change, that's a whole separate code section. We've kind of moved out of what we're doing here. So I understand there could be, I guess, some perceptive difficulty, but, I think that's pretty clear cut. The other thing I wanted to point out is I haven't seen this with solar or necessarily in Oregon, but it's a pretty common business practice in other states when you have an industrialized use on rural lands to avoid the remediation efforts to get it upzoned at the end of the use period to like an industrial zoning or something like that, that would have a lower remediation requirement in terms of putting the property back as it was. And so I think this is a pretty good and clear statement that form of zone change at the end of the use, at least being justified by the existence of the solar farm previously, is not okay.
Yeah, I think if the reference in D was under the rule we are adopting, so 66420, and it said, if you're getting your exception because you're special, then Well, and I guess in that instance, then there wouldn't be an exception at all, right, John? So,
Well, I don't know. It depends. I think if you're proposing a project size that's above what could ordinarily be considered as a conditional use, and um, you're not eligible to utilize the finding opportunities reducing conflict Division 23 process, I think it requires an exception.
but the cross reference is to any time there is an exception. So I guess then the question is, maybe for Damien, when you take an exception for a zone change, is that exception done under 664?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're trying to say, and John, correct me, is sort of just because a lot of counties handle exception processes differently, like how they either do or don't amend their comp plan or do or don't create separate exception lands. And it's a little bit of a pastiche that the default is intended to be if you get an exception for solar, you just stay zoned what you're zoned. I think just tweaking some of the language to make that a little clearer, I think could happen, right? Because Mark's use case brought up a good question, like, are we intending to preclude counties from allowing zone changes either at the time that a request is being that an exception is being requested, right? So could you request both an exception and a zone change, or years in the future after then exceptions happened and decades have passed? So I never actually thought about that as far as like what this language was trying to do, but it does say shall remain in the same zone, and it doesn't put like parameters on it, kind of. So I think we could just, tighten up the intentionality of, because, and John, tell me if I'm wrong, but I think what we're just trying to say is like, when you go in and get a goal exception, you say what specific standards you want an exception from, and your same zone and your same zoning and all the other standards still apply.
Right.
And I think that's a fine default as far as like what should happen. But if we're also trying to say, county, you shall not change zoning standard, you shall not give a zone change over some duration, we should probably say that directly. I never really thought about it that way.
So Damien, you're right. I think you're thinking through this in the right way. And so that's what we're attempting to do is the reasons exception, or this area of the rule 0018, provides some direction for how these areas should be zoned. Now, these would be reasons exceptions, right? So they'd be subject to sub 4. There is some language there already. And this would clarify that, or attempts to clarify the intention is when you have taken an exception for, you've justified the departure from the ordinary standards are okay for solar, photovoltaic solar, that the zone stays the same. Now, if it came back, I haven't really thought through a long-term situation, but if you came back in some period of time, and we're able to say, we've learned that this area is particularly well suited, it has a comparative advantage for this type of industrial use or this type of commercial use or whatever it is. I think the county could consider a new reasons exception that may result in a zone change at that point. This is where it's a little bit different than other things, right? I mean, if we're talking about more trade sector type stuff, if we're talking about a factory, that's okay to site on rural lands because of the features there, right? That probably is going to require a zone change because EFU doesn't allow a factory. But this is different because EFU does, and really it's a relief from those acreage thresholds that that is the outcome. Brandon, I see your hand up, bud.
Yeah, John, I agree with the application of this. It's and would agree with what your feedback was on here. If there was an addition to this particular language that simply stated if there was another, or something that stated if there was another application for a reasons exception, you would follow the normal reasons exceptions protocol. I think this is very specifically saying what it is. If you elect to go through this path, it's simply down this path, and that's it. And the underlying zoning designation or classification remains the same. If you want to jump outside of that, here's the reasons exception if you want to do that.
So Brandon, just to follow up on that, so you're not reading this as it's currently worded in the way that Max and Damien, or Max particularly, was sort of worried about, in that it would limit the county's ability to change the zone like forever. You're not reading it that way.
I don't see that right now, but I do see where it may make sense to maybe add an additional clarifying statement to it that says if any applicable exceptions process outside of this subsection shall follow a different exceptions process, such as reasons or irrevocably committed or whatever the leg needs to be there. But if we're going to paint ourselves into a corner with this language, if that's the worry, then simply add a clarifying statement that a local jurisdiction can utilize other reasons exceptions process or other exceptions processes if found necessary.
Thanks for that further conversation about that. Max, what do you think about that?
Would there be any objection to adding in here when a local government approves an exception for a photovoltaic solar power generation facility under OAR 660-33-130 pursuant to, like, adding in the cross-reference to the facility is being permitted as a conditional use under Division 33. That way it's more clearly tied to kind of that process, and it is then very clearly not related to future zone changes, future comp plan changes, any other issues where someone then raises this and says, well, you're not allowed to do that.
I see Brandon nodding his head. John, what do you think?
I think that if it, it sounds like it would maintain what we're trying to accomplish while adding additional clarity and helping people feel more comfortable. I think that's why we're talking about it. I think that if we can, if we can figure that out, then by all means. We may want to, look at this a little bit, think a little about it offline. If Damien and Max want to think about it and offer some thoughts, that we could bring back for final consideration before the LCDC hearing when we get together on the 9th of January. Maybe that's a pathway. Andrew, your hand's up.
Yeah, not being a land use attorney, I just want to make sure, and I'm going to trust you, John, and the department to validate this, that suggestion would also keep the comfort of the other side of saying, I don't want to give up ag land without realizing it.
Yeah. I'm glad you said that, Andrea. That's what I was thinking too. It's like, all right, let's make sure that.
Right.
Yeah. So, I mean, because we clearly heard that it's very important to retain, that that underlying zone. And if a county was to do something different, then there's processes associated with how that would happen, but it wouldn't necessarily be through this through this rule. Yeah. Thanks, Brandon, for that vigorous thumbs up. Mike?
Yeah, maybe a potential scenario along these lines might be a solar generating plant tied with a microgrid to a data center out in a rural area. The data center would clearly need, if it was going to be on EFU land, it would clearly require a zone change, whereas the solar part might not. It couldn't somehow sneak in there under the solar generating exception that we're talking about. Anyway, just one possible scenario.
So we've got several other sections to move through. I feel like we've got a path forward here, that the interest is to retain the underlying zone. But to make sure that it's clear that if a county were to pursue a zone change, that, they could do that, and there's processes for them to do that, that this doesn't prohibit them from using the processes to make that happen. But for purposes of this rule, that the interest is to retain that underlying zone. That's what I'm hearing. And that we've got some language in the chat. John and Adam can take that, they can follow up, and we'll look for another statement as a part of this when we see the rule again. Are we good to move on?
Sure feels like it. I
Okay.
think we're ready to look at
Mark says it's okay. Look at Mark's like, go. All right, so again, now we're looking at Division 6.
Correct.
And there's two specific questions in your packet
There
about that.
are.
John's
Yeah.
going to walk us through.
Yeah, right. So we have decided, the REC has decided to kind of postpone additional conversations about forest land. This is the forest land rule with regards to trying to figure out the forest centric things that we kind of got high standard on so far. That's not to say we'll never do it, but we were in agreement that this isn't the time. But there's a couple questions left, and I think, just two. And the first one is here in lines 14 through 17. And as we've talked about, there never really has been a conversation about renewable energy facilities on forest land. All the emphasis has been farmland, and that's led to subsequent rules, dating back quite some time. What this could do, and we're not, feel strongly one way or the other, but wanted to put it on the table, is could it make sense to consider for Eastern Oregon elevating the size threshold for a conditional use, doesn't require an exception, doesn't trigger FSEC, but a straightforward plain vanilla conditional use from what is now only 10 acres to something larger. That's what we did with particularly with the non-arable piece of the farmland rule. And so we thought it could be reasonable to have a conversation. We've offered 240 acres, as possibly that marker. That's commensurate with, or we feel at least consistent with the approach on agricultural land for those non-arable lands. 320 acres is the threshold for a farm or ranch related dwelling on those lands. It's also the threshold for a photovoltaic solar project. In this context, the forest context, 240 acres is the marker, the size for a large tract dwelling on forest land. We thought that might be a place to start. Not that it's apples and oranges, it's not the same thing, but maybe 240 acres is a place to consider. If in fact it felt reasonable to elevate. If it doesn't feel reasonable, then let's not do it. But we didn't want to, I guess, complete the conversation without at least putting it on the table. So that's the first question. Why don't we run down to the second question real quick, and then we can come back. Or what do you guys want to do? What's the pleasure of the group? Should we talk about this now, or do you want to go? Maybe I'll just say real quickly. The second piece is in response to what we talked about just a second ago. Yeah, let's go ahead and go down. This is all the stuff we're not doing. Let's go around to the bottom. Yeah, so this piece on lines 15 through 17 is intended, and we'll probably need to include this for Eastern Oregon. We've been strictly advised that we're not adjusting things for Western Oregon. But the point is, as we talked before, that this be guidance on in these areas, you know, where the zone is probably a timber grazing zone or a forest grazing zone. They're protected under Goal 3 and Goal 4, to provide the direction of what you do when you are in receipt of an application for solar project. Do you use the Division 6 standards for forest land or the Division 33 standards for agricultural land? This says, look at the predominant use. Predominant use is farm, use Division 33. If it's predominantly forest, use Division 6. So that's, again, that's an attempt to clarify what the correct approach would be, and, you know, remove the doubt to the extent that it may exist. So those are two questions. I think we probably feel this is something that could be, you know, genuinely helpful, you know, providing that comment, that clarity. And then, you know, the other piece about elevating the threshold for a conditional use on forest land, you know, we think it's reasonable to talk about too. So maybe we want to go back up and talk about that, the acreage threshold, and then talk about this, or vice versa. I'm open. I'll do whatever you guys want to do.
Okay, well, let's see who weighs in on this. Damien.
Yeah, thanks. You know, I think generally starting at the end there, that sub 4 makes a lot of sense, with the context being that there's some case law out there that says in farm forest areas you apply both farm and forest standards. So
how does that work, Damien?
Don't ask me. I don't know, but it's all applicable. All divisions, just go for it. I think it basically boils down to you just choose the most restrictive one when things are conflicting between the farm and the forest standards. So if we don't clarify that, there'll be strong potential that any project on farm forest land could be challenged if it's greater than 10 acres, because that's the sort of forest default. And so that, you know, I think a predominance test is fine. There's a whole bunch of, you know, rules around what does it mean to be predominant at a particular time and all that stuff. That's all sort of been hashed out over time in different contexts. So I think that gives sort of toggles on farm forest for applicability of the rules that were created, you know, drafting here today. Otherwise, I think default farm forest will be 10-acre max, irrespective of anything that we're talking about short of an exception.
Greg?
Yeah, thank you. I've always thought that the 10-acre threshold was kind of unhelpfully low. So I am fine with the concept of raising that, what that number should be pegged at. I have far less of an opinion on. I don't know what's the right number there, and would certainly look to others to weigh in on it. As far as the second question, I guess a question I have is, if you have we Green Diamond, you know, we're really only dealing in the forest land context, so I don't have experience here, and so I may not be the best person to speak to this, and kind of goes back to one of the reasons we're doing some of the forestry is I don't know that we have the right people here that have this type of property to weigh in, but not sure if the focus on the tract is the right focus, if it's conceivable or even likely that a project could be sited on a mixed use tract, but only cited in one or the other of the types of use on that tract. So for example, you know, you might have a tract that's predominantly forest, but there's ag type land that is really what is most suitable for siting the solar project. And then you're going to analyze the siting of that solar project under forest rules instead of ag rules. I don't know how likely that is, but it seems like it's at least a theoretical possibility and might create some unintended consequences.
And then Max also had a point in the chat about is January 1st, 24 the right date? Where did that date come from?
So Andrea has her hand up. Maybe
Yeah,
turn
to
her.
respond to Max's
Yeah, go ahead,
question
Andrea.
there. More on the end of not some other point in time like application completeness, because I have my cynical hat on today. You don't want somebody gaming the system and like stopping farming or stopping doing something for 6 months while an application is being developed in order to get around this. So I think whether it's January 1, 2024, or no, I mean, that to me, that's a fine date, but some point where it's before the rules come into effect so that it's not then used as a gaming factor.
Yeah, point well taken, Andrea. I guess, Damien, is one of these more difficult than the other? Like, would a developer try to game the use of the property to try and meet the standards in for ag as opposed to forest? Because one of the standards are going to apply no matter what, right? So like, I think the only question about gaming is whether or not there would be a game to play in terms of getting it out of ag and getting it into forest production.
Yeah, I mean, I think that depends on the first edit, right? Like if it's possible to have a project bigger than 10 acres on forest land, then that might be an interesting path. But it's all so fact dependent, right? It gets back to the larger question of our, if you're on ag land, are these rules availing you of an opportunity and all that stuff? But
yeah,
if we don't increase um, the acreage allowance in forest, then there's not a whole lot there. But yeah, I think what Andrea said is probably right. I'd flip it on its head that it's probably more likely that if you put a date in the future, someone would cut down a bunch of trees, as opposed to stop farming and then try and convince everyone it's forestry, though.
Yeah. Well, that being said, I'd support the language as written, John, unless there's further thoughts on the use of the word tract.
So I really appreciate that, guys. And
I mean,
go ahead, David.
That's a good one though. The tract, like tract's got all these contiguous properties under the same ownership. If you take it down to parcel, that might work better.
Yeah, so we're going to see similar language in proposed for Division 33. But one difference, a big, especially you're talking about industrial landowners like Greg represents, these tracts are gigantic, right? And so maybe that's the reason, like Damien said, maybe a parcel, looking at the parcel, or looking at the site can make more sense in a forest context, just given the size of some of these ownerships.
Yeah,
There's
Mark.
Oh, go ahead, please. I'm
I
sorry.
was just saying Mark had a comment in the chat as well. So are we good with this language as proposed? Do we want to, is there more conversation about tract versus parcel? Pros and cons of that?
I would encourage people to think about it, and maybe we can. Max says changing it to parcel. I think that could be, like I said, I think that could be reasonable. To give a better, finer point on things. It's written as it is because we just, really kind of copied and pasted a lot of from the stuff above regarding dwellings, and that's really a whole different deal, right?
Yeah.
Mark, your hands up,
Mark?
bud.
Yeah, go ahead, Mark.
I think my only concern with predominant use is if you have a 70-30 forest land, farmland, right? Situation in terms of land use, the productivity is probably still more with the farmland. And so if there is a lesser bar for the forestry standards, then yeah, it'll be subjecting it to kind of a potentially a greater loss than is otherwise intended.
Yeah, I think that gets to Greg's question too, Mark. So I wonder about, John, as you know, like the applications typically don't have a footprint, but if the developer were going to ask for a conditional use permit on a parcel, but we're going to commit to placing the footprint on the less productive side, then is there language that could say, predominant use of the parcel or the footprint of the site, if presented something like that gives that flexibility to, or promotes developers to actually put the site on the less productive part of the parcel? I hope that makes sense, Mark, but I think that's what you're talking about.
It is, yeah, and also just like a lower standard for benefit, even though, for by way of example, is if you had like mixed field crop and forest products on a piece of property, the field crop's probably a 5x productivity on a per acre basis over the forest land. And so, the forest review standard is probably not appropriate, if that makes sense, Max. So I do hear what you're saying, and I think that's a good idea. I'm just not sure it's also the most direct addressment for what I think I'm trying to point out there, which is the potential gamesmanship kind of aspect if we're using forest use standards on properties where we know the ag is the minority of use, but the majority of productivity. Does that make sense? But I do like the idea of incentivizing that development being on the forest portion of the property. My concern about that is the reason why it's probably not on the ag is slope. And so it may not be feasible in a lot of those cases.
Okay, I got a couple more hands up. Max and then Laura.
Sorry, mine was a relic.
Laura, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say there can be values to the forest land use beyond productivity, and so like habitat, and so I'd be a little hesitant to put in language pushing a choice purely from a productivity perspective. But otherwise, I don't have an issue with the general direction of the language.
Okay, so sounds like where we're at is that people are mostly supportive, at least the people that we've heard from. If they're not supportive, I hope that you will weigh in, and that there is a idea on the table to change tract to parcel, and there's some support for that. Any heartburn about any other pros, cons about moving tract to parcel, or any other thoughts on this one so we can move on? Looks like we're ready to move on. So, making sure, John, did you get, so there were 2 questions in Division 6.
This is the other one.
Yeah, okay.
Correct. I mean, is there an interest? Does it seem reasonable? We've heard it very well could be, in elevating or kind of carving out, a description or a provision for specifically for solar, photovoltaic solar generation in Eastern Oregon, as written above, it's all the same thing. It's all 10 acres, whether it's wind or solar or nuclear or whatever. So this would specifically call out photovoltaic solar and elevate that to something above 10 acres.
John, can you say again where the 240 came from?
Yeah, Max, again, and that, we're not planting our flag on that number. That's the same size as a large tract forest dwelling in Eastern Oregon. So if you have 240 contiguous acres in Eastern Oregon, you're eligible for a forest related dwelling. Just as on the farm side, the non-arable land at 320 acres, you're eligible for a farm or ranch related dwelling. So we just kind of relied on that as an indicator.
Okay, that's sensible.
It's not meant to be an apples and apples comparison. It's just sort of where we just start. It seemed like a reasonable place to start.
Yep, makes sense to me. Thanks.
So the question on the table is, does it make sense?
I think my question on this is, does a change say to 240 acres? Like, is that meaningful from a development perspective? And just recognizing we didn't make a ton of progress in the forest conversation. We know that's something we want to come back to. Is this like a useful step in the right direction in the interim, or do we want to just save the whole conversation for when we have more of the right people at the table?
I think it's definitely useful and a very good kind of leapfrog lily pad, so to say, to get something done on forest that I think is reasonable. And that 240 would be smaller size facilities, somewhere between like 30 and 50 megs. So there could be a couple projects that could use this, and I think that's worth doing, but that's just my opinion.
So what about hearing from Mike, and then what about Greg or John? I wonder if we want to hear from Dan on this.
So Dan was good enough to email me on this, and I would certainly welcome his comments. I'm not sure that this is a policy matter that the Department of Forestry would care to weigh in on. But let's let him say that.
Let's let him say that. Just kind of piggybacking on Laura's observation.
Mike, I can let Michael go first if he wants to, since he had his hand up there.
Yeah, I just conceptually, I'm not sure that it makes sense from, say, a carbon sequestration or the ultimate goal of responding to climate change by producing renewable energy, whether it makes sense to cut down trees in order to put up solar panels. That, to me, that's a disconnect. I could be convinced otherwise in certain circumstances, but just as a general approach, that just doesn't make sense to me. Thank you.
All right, so should I jump in there real quick if that's all right? So yeah, so I haven't had a chance to run this up ODF's management chain and get an official answer on this, but my strong instinct is that this is a policy question that's outside ODF's regulatory purview. I can see the policy arguments like what Mike just said, and I can also see the policy argument to raise it and facilitate that pathway. I think it's a question for the RAC. If that's a workable pathway that's going to facilitate more development and the RAC wants to do that, that's a fair policy question. And if the RAC feels, and I think it's a reasonable position, like Michael said too, that cutting down trees for solar development isn't the path you want to go, that's a reasonable policy choice too. I don't think, and again, this is not a formal opinion, but I don't think ODF would weigh in on that. And I can't think of any technical specific reason why we would say, not 240 acres, but 320 acres or some other number. So that's at least my instinct, is I think this is a policy question that's fair, and I don't think we would try to weigh in on it either way.
Thanks, Dan, for that. Damien and Mark, go ahead. Actually, Damien and then Mark.
Fair enough. We don't want to talk all at the same time.
Mhm.
But yeah, generally, I think I'm supportive. It may create more opportunities. Generally, forest land is a little more difficult, right? You got more slope, you got more trees. I don't think anyone's going to, for the size of acres that we're talking about, no one's trying to clear cut 240 acres of trees, right? Like it just becomes a whole logistical thing that people would look to find opportunity elsewhere. Projects at that size don't really have that, the margin to just run teams of lumberjacks and such. But I think more likely this would open up a little bit of opportunity on the many, many acres of land that are zoned forest, but not really what you think of when you think of a forest, that aren't completely covered in trees, that are relatively flat and open and that type of thing. Just because the zoning's imperfect, it was done primarily by aerial photography in the 70s and 80s, right? So um, so long-winded way of saying the projects that I've seen on forest land have never involved clear cutting. It's just been like, a site that's suitable for solar. It just happens to be zone forest. So I think I would agree with, I think it was Mike that said, yeah, it doesn't make sense to cut down 240 acres of trees to put up solar panels. But I don't think that's a use case that seems particularly likely to play out.
Thanks, Damien. Mark?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm not sure I agree. Reasons being two. One is that, in terms of the carbon accounting aspects of it, for every megawatt of clean energy that you're creating, you're removing about 800 pounds per hour of carbon emission. When you compare that to carbon sequestration on a forest site, on 7 acres, they're not doing 800 pounds per hour. And so that's comparison, they are more sequestering than, let's say, non-arable rangeland, but the delta is still pretty big in both cases. The other thing is to the economics of cutting trees, and Greg could probably hop in more on this, but I mean, you shouldn't have to pay to sell trees, Damien. You know what I mean? Like they are the product for development. So I mean, if you do things right, you identify a mature stand that would otherwise be ready for cut, and you contract a logger, and they're buying the trees from you directly. There's now the site preparation, I imagine, is where, and the stump removal and those other things that may not happen in a commercial forestry operation is probably where the lost margin is. But I don't know what that actually looks like. But yeah, economically, I can't see any reason why you wouldn't want to cut down 240 acres. In that if you're a forest owner, there's a significant lease income that would come from that, and you could liquidate some inventory at the same time. From a business context, that makes all the sense in the world from the landowner perspective.
All right, we've got a flurry of hands up on this one. Dan, go ahead.
Yeah, just following on Mark's comment there briefly. We've looked at sites that were recently cleared. So, yeah, you still have to remove the stumps, and that's, I don't know, a couple $1,000 an acre maybe. Haven't priced it lately, but there are some sites like that. And again, we look typically at smaller stuff. We're not looking at 240 acres generally.
Thank you, Dan. Dugan?
We'll take the other side of that. For the large developers, we're not looking at things that are, 320 or even 240. So, I'll just, one of the few things I'll say is like, I'm not building this kind of stuff. I will say Pine Gate, from our personal experience working in the Carolinas, we have done some, I think you have to think of the counterfactual. Is that forest land going to be harvested at a certain point anyway, right? Because it's private forest, often it's private forest land. So like if that's happening anyway, is putting the solar there, you know, fine, or as Mark was pointing out, like a different I don't know what the exact carbon accounting would be. Also, some companies like Pinegate we have a kind of 2-for-1 Arbor Day donation where we will plant 2 trees for every tree that's cut down for one of our projects. So I think there's definitely an acknowledgement of that impact, but I do think we need to think about, these are often commercial operations that have kind of life cycles and things like that around their harvesting schedules. I can let people who actually do that talk more about that, but while it feels bad, and as someone who cares a lot about climate, I definitely want to focus on what's maximizing it. You know you have to think about what would happen in absence of the solar farm being there. So that's what I try to focus on.
All right, Max.
Thanks. Yeah, I agree with what everyone's saying. I think it can go both ways, like at least in my experience, solar or forest landowners are not looking to cut down a bunch of trees to replace a stand that's been growing for 40 years with solar panels. It's going to align with natural kind of market factors and cutting timelines. So I don't view there really being a replacement risk, especially at this low of acreage. And I think doing something like this is an important opportunity to make a meaningful change here when we do have a lot of uncertainty about whether we're making meaningful change on the ag side. So I fully support this change. And I guess, John, I was going to ask if you have any history on where the 10 acres came from, because as we talked about kind of at the beginning of this rulemaking, in my view, the thresholds for goal exceptions on ag land was arbitrary. And I'm guessing that the 10 acres on forest lands was also arbitrary. So I think it's appropriate to modify that at this point in time.
John,
So
did you have
I
any?
think Greg and I are staring each other down, waiting to see who's going to go first. Just real quick, the oral history of the department indicates that the 1220 rule and on farmland, agricultural land, that had been the indicator, was based on the believed footprint of a natural gas fire plant. I suspect that got translated into the forest rule as well, but I'm really not sure. I think it stands to reason it could have been, but I don't know. I just don't know, Max.
Greg, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to be clear that from at least our perspective as a forest land owner, the business case for putting solar on timberland is pretty heavily favors solar, whether the timber is mature or not. The way we structure our deals, we account for that. But if you have a stand of trees that's marketable, that's merchantable timber, we'll go in, we'll harvest that timber, we'll sell it, which is what we would normally do anyway. And then rather going in and replanting it, the solar developer will go in and do site prep and put up solar panels. If the timber is not yet merchantable, then we'll ask for compensation for a return on the investment that we have in that timber at that point in time. And then that timber would be removed for the benefit of the solar project. And the economics work out, from my experience so far, work out both for the solar developer and for the landowner.
So let me put a bow on this. It sounds like there's a lot of support for changing this. That there's more to be gained than potentially lost. It sounds like the only caveat here is around the 240 acres. Is that the right number? Is it, but how do we determine it to be a different number? I'm not hearing people saying that that's the wrong number. It's just whether or not we've got the right people here to weigh in on if it's the right number. And that would be ODF. So, but I'm hearing a lot of support for this change. There's a question that Tom asks from Odo about can solar panels be put over stumps, or is stump removal required? I think we heard from Dan that there was a project that they talked about, and they did the stump removal. I don't know, Greg, you want to speak to that?
Well, it's a question for a developer more than it is for a landowner. I'd just say that I'm pretty sure that what that does is that significantly increases the cost of the racking system to raise it up, and it may just not be possible to do it. I'm not aware of any developers that are proposing to do that on any properties that I'm aware of. They're planning on going in and removing stumps.
Thanks, Greg. Laura asked the question in the chat about, is this just for clarifying, this is just, we're talking Eastern Oregon, right? So John, you want to answer that? And then Andrea, I see your hand up.
At this juncture, we are speaking solely to Eastern Oregon, that being the portion of the state east of the crest of the Cascades, not including Hood River County.
Okay, Andrea?
Yeah, I just want to clarify. I don't think you're hearing strong support. I think you're hearing some support, and you're hearing a lot of silence from folks who don't know enough to weigh in.
Yeah, I appreciate that clarification, Andrea. Thank you. Mark?
Yeah, I think I'd support Andrea in that. I mean, I don't know if I support this. It's largely because I'm not sure acreage is the defining factor in determining conflict. It's the fact it is the measuring stick we have right now, right? And so I've been trying to go scenarioizing, 240, 10. John, I understand what you were saying in the comparison point for a forest dwelling, but a forest dwelling and a solar farm aren't the same thing. And and so that's I think this is one I'm gonna have to meditate on probably a little bit prior to the vote, frankly.
Okay, well, I mean, I think that's fair, and I appreciate when you hear my summary. One of the reasons why I do that is to check in, and so I'm glad that folks weigh in and say, "Well, actually, not quite." So what I'm hearing is that from the development community, there's some support for this, that this helps, that this could help in citing some facilities, and what I'm hearing from folks who are advocates for habitat or for ag or for forestry is that there's potentially some concerns around swapping out trees and the role that they play with solar development. There's also some questions around the size. Is 240 too much, too little? Where did that come from? And so I'm hearing people wanting to sit with this a little bit more. I don't know that there's more conversation that we need to have today about this. And I just want to make sure that we understand what's going to happen next. So it sounds like, John, that you're not proposing any more steps to get different language here between now and when we see this again, but more people want to sit with it and maybe do some more thinking about how this might work.
Yeah, that sounds right, Jamie.
I just want to manage expectations about what would happen next.
Yeah.
Okay, so what I propose right now is we had a break scheduled at 11:40. We've been sitting now working on together for over 2 hours. I suggest we take a 10-minute break now and then come back and focus in on Division 33. And there are, I think, 7 questions. Yes. So if you look at page 12 of your packet, there are 7 questions that John is focusing our conversation around Division 33, and we'll pick that up here in 10 minutes. So that would take us to about 11:22 by my clock. Does that sound good? Good thumbs up from a couple people.
Sounds good.
10-minute break. We'll come right back. Thanks, everyone. Welcome back.
Welcome back.
So we're going to focus in on Division 33. And as requested at our last meeting, Mike, it was really helpful when Mike said, hey, it would be great if you could focus us in on what is it that you want us to weigh in on. So John and his team spent some time, and you'll see on page 12 of your packet, there are 7 questions here. And John, I figured we just would start at the top, number 1, and keep going down and work through each one, just like we just did with the questions related to Division 4 and 6.
I think so. And we can kind of cover them just right now, kind of over an overview, and then turn to the text or whatever. Yeah, I think that might be well. So some of these questions I hope will be fairly easy to answer. Starting at, I know we just said we'll start at the top, but the bottom one, question number 7, deals with the predominant use. I think we largely resolved that for Division 6, the forest land. So hopefully the conversation, the feeling could be similar here as well. But going back to the top, I think one of the first questions for us is, how do we structure this language in Division 33? Now, it's important, and Division 33 needs to be revised because in order to carry out the pathway identified in Division 23, the acreage thresholds in Division 33 for farmland need to be elevated. We need to make sure that there's harmony there. We started out and we had kind of offered a new section. It was section 45, or maybe be 42 at the end of the day. And then we tucked everything back into 38. So I think just getting some direction on a preference, do we just have one section, everything's in 38, or do we end up with 2? Western Oregon being 38 and then Eastern Oregon being, let's just say, 45. Our feeling is that while it would make the rule longer, and we generally try to avoid that, having specific sections for each side of the state could help reduce some confusion, which is always a good thing, and that it could help guarantee that we're not changing anything for Western Oregon, which again is our steadfast direction on that. So our thoughts would be that let's go ahead and just use a new tool and create a new division, or excuse, a new section. It's very similar to how we bifurcated the sites versus areas in Division 23. The other people moving down, question 2. I'll try to go a little more quickly. Question 2 is where to the extent that we need to elevate the acreage thresholds for projects subject to the Division 23 pathway. What are the right ones? We talked about this a little bit before, and so I'm hopeful that we don't need to spend a huge amount of time. But what we've done is we've created some sizes that would be smaller for the consideration of individual sites that don't require plan amendment and would be directly applicable, and where counties have gone through the more detailed and more robust process, including the community engagement, so on and so forth, to establish areas that they would have a larger threshold. Those are kind of based on the original provisions in House Bill 2329, codified in ORS 215-446, as well as the updated sizes that came about a couple of years ago. And then as a follow-up, we've kind of left it open-ended with regard to the situation on non-arable lands where a county has established areas. We just sort of said there is no threshold in those rules. And I don't know if that makes sense or not. If it doesn't, then we'll just drop it. We're not planting a flag there. We're just saying, let's talk about it. The next thing I think is a little more nuanced. We've heard a lot about from different people. I don't know if all of them are here or not, but the notion of cumulative impacts and having some ability to assess them one way or the other. That does reside as the study area concept in existing Division 33. We've sort of offered a enlarged study area. But what that does is when there's a certain amount of development either on the ground or that has been granted its building permits. So it's not just approved, not land use approval. It's, where they're imminent to happen, they're vested to happen. It triggers a review, and that review doesn't prescribe an outcome, but it does obligate a county to look at different things and try to determine whether, the stability of the overall land use pattern will be materially altered. It's a mouthful. Other things, we would like to hear if it makes sense, and we think it does, to offer a more straightforward approach towards meeting the farm and forest compatibility criteria that we've put at the bottom of that sheet, but it's more elaborate. It's more elaborate now, and there's a lot of complexities to it. We think having it more of a straightforward thing could be beneficial, at least in certain circumstances. We've talked about additional approval standards that would apply across the board, particularly the soil health, and which is trying to avoid a bearer circumstance, wildfire and temporary workforce housing. And and then we get to the predominant use stuff as we talked about with the forest rule. So that I think is the width and breadth of the main things we'd like to discuss and hopefully resolve today.
All right, I know that was a lot in terms of an overview. Hopefully people were following along in their packet on page 12. But now we're going to go back up to the top and we're going to go through each one just like we did with Division 4 and 6. And so, Ariella, if you could put the rule on the screen. And then if folks are looking at their packet on page 12, Division 30, I think it's page 12. Yeah. At the top, the first question.
Right. So the first question is, do we keep it all in this section 38, or do we split it out? And so section 38 would become the section applicable to Western Oregon, and we would have we'd have a companion new section that would be specific to Eastern Oregon. And beyond that, I think that the language probably is we probably can go through it because it would be the same. Right.
Yeah, it's the same.
Yeah.
And so, John, when we were doing our team meeting, getting ready for this meeting, we had talked a little bit about, while the RAC, this is a RAC process, and all of this product is a RAC product. There are some sections where there's information that the agency has that in terms of how these are implemented, that's helpful, I think, for the RAC to understand. And I think this was one of those areas about, is it all bundled or is it separate? And so I didn't know, John, if you or Gordon wanted to just share a little bit, just to make sure that the RAC had that information as a part of their considerations.
Yeah, I'll start, and then if Gordon wants to help me out and correct me or add what I forget. It's really fairly simple, but it's important, right? It's kind of a subtle but important difference, and that is that having a new section itself can really help guarantee that there's not a confusion. We spoke with our farm and forest coordinator and others internally, and folks were really felt better about using a new section so as not to create confusion when it's being implemented at the local level. And then also, it would provide us much more certainty and guarantee that we're not inadvertently changing things for Western Oregon, which haven't been discussed, haven't been the topic of conversation, and really would fall outside of what we believe the parameters of this rulemaking. So due to those factors, we would really encourage, we get based on our our concerns about about confusion and so on and so forth, that we go ahead and create a new section that applies specifically to Eastern Oregon. So Gordon, if you have
I just thank you, John. I just wanted to reiterate that I think um, the people that are going to be implementing these in counties, we believe it would be much easier if counties in Eastern Oregon looked at Section 45 or whatever it is, and counties in Western Oregon looked at Section 38. You can argue about that, but secondly, the concern I have, having seen a lot of inadvertent rule writing errors over the years, rules that have been reviewed by many, many very smart lawyers, and somehow things still go through the cracks. And I really have a concern that do not want to do any changes to anything in Western Oregon involving solar. That's not our work. And if we combine, I think there's much more opportunity for error, mischief, future mischief by and other inventive attorneys trying to stop something using language that's, oh, did this, it looks like this applies to Western Oregon. I think having two sections, 38 for Western Oregon and a new one for Eastern Oregon, would be the best way to prevent that from happening to the extent that it can be completely prevented. So that's my take on it.
Thanks, John and Gordon. And again, this isn't meant to be heavy-handed. It's more of there's a wide range of interests that these rules are trying to address, and some of those are the department's interests. And so, when we were preparing for this meeting and when I was listening to some of the concerns that the department was raising, I recommended that they bring this up to make sure that you, as the RAC, had that information as a part of your considerations. So let's pause there and look at question number 1 and see what questions and thoughts people have. Max?
Well, before we go there, yeah, I appreciate that background, guys. And I'll just remind folks that we had this conversation previously, and there was a draft circulated where I believe it was broken out into a separate section that added another 15 pages to the rule, which creates a lot more review and work for members of the RAC, and both things are true, right, Gordon? Like, yes, we want to avoid making changes to the Western Oregon standard. I think we also want to avoid making changes to the Eastern Oregon standard for the portions of, or for those projects that are not going to benefit from this rulemaking. And that was the concern that I think we expressed when that last draft came out, was that it was a lot of work and difficult to ensure that that new section was not going to be making any changes to the standard process. So I'll just request that there's adequate time and opportunity for the lawyers on the development side to review that draft and make sure that it isn't making changes where they're not intended to be made. So I'll just leave it there.
Thanks, Max.
Appreciate that, Max. Thank you.
Yeah, and Max, yeah, I do appreciate that, because I was thinking back to the reason why, one of the reasons why that was combined was exactly as you stated, was because we were looking for ways to streamline the rule, to have it not be so weighty. Other folks want to weigh in on this? Damien?
Yeah, I understand trying to figure out the best way to do stuff, and I think cross references just go a long way. There is no reason to copy and paste pages and pages of the same thing and say it applies on each half of the state. Also, I think that'll keep everyone kind of connected. That one of the things that we talked about earlier is kind of farm forest standards and how those got to a very weird place because we created this sort of farm forest zone, and then the farm standards did what they did and the forest standards did what they did, and never the two shall meet, but the rules say that they all apply. We kind of get into an odd place where we have separate standards that are in legislative efforts to pass a rule that changes things in both or whatever it is in the future, and then you're touching two different things. I think for those reasons, I think we can be very clear that what provisions of the same section apply where. I think we can be clearer and not like blending these and just say resource sites and resource areas and as defined in Division 23, and that it will be in the eastern part of the state. And we can have standards that are applicable there, and everything else just stays applicable statewide, and not blend too many things. I think that's doable, but to the extent it sounds like there's a strong push from staff to have two separate sections for separate parts of the state. Just know that that's going to, cause confusion down the line because there will be some version of regulations that happen sometime over time that aren't specific to half of the state. And to the extent we have to go down that path, just do it with cross references, and that way where the two sections are at least speaking to each other.
Thanks, Damien. Other thoughts or questions or concerns?
So Jamie, what I think I'd like to do, if we can, I think that obviously I don't want to cut anybody off, but we might be at a point to move forward. I'd like to put together, kind of recreate what that different section would look like. I meant to do that before today. I just couldn't get to it, and then share that out, particularly with the folks that Max and Damien mentioned. Let them take a look at it. Anybody else for that matter too, and then we can come back and really see how we want to go, or how the RAC wants to go next month.
Okay, so you've heard from Max and Damien kind of reminding us about sort of why we bundled these together in the first place, and then the RAC has heard some concerns that have come up from the department side about some considerations about why that we might want to separate them. And so, John, if you can develop that, and then to Max's point, giving people enough time to look at that, to make to do that. And then, and I think that what Damien is saying is, hey, if it's all bundled together, let's just really focus in on those cross references and as a way to keep this streamlined. So I think we have two paths. And I think the missing piece is what a new section would look like. That's a separate section, and to give people enough time for review. And so John's going to take that on.
Yeah, I'll take a crack at that ASAP.
Okay. And then we'll flag this as a loose end to wrap up in January, but also hopefully that would come out soon enough that people could weigh in or talk to John about it in between now and January. Okay, let's go ahead and go look at number 2.
So let's keep going. And let's stop. So there are a couple things going on here, and the language at line 1 really kind of has to do with another piece. That's the workforce housing thing that we would have if we had a Eastern Oregon specific section. We would include that in the definition of photovoltaic solar energy generation facility, or whatever it is, identifying that workforce housing can be part of the project, which we borrowed directly out of the wind rule. So maybe just put a pin in that for now. But as we go down and starting on 12, what we're going to be entering, so a little different terminology. I know it's confusing, but I think it's necessary. And when we talk in Division 23, we're talking about soil types and irrigation, things like that. We're not necessarily talking about actual categories as they're lined up in Division 33 and in state statute. So we kind of have to translate them back into what they mean for purposes of this rule. And again, we need to adjust these pieces to make sure we can get where we want to go with the Division 23 pathway. So starting there, you will see that we've got 3 categories of agricultural land. High value farmland is the first. Yep, and we're going to stop right there for now. Thank you. We have high value farmland, then we'll, kind of cascade down to arable land and then ultimately non-arable land. And each of these areas has some specific parameters that apply to these categories. And then there's also some general ones that kind of apply across the board. So that's kind of what we'll be looking at here. For high value farmland, which is as we talked about, based on soils or based on inclusion in an irrigation district or being the site of an irrigation water right or an AVA, how things typically work is that 12 acres is the ceiling for a conditional use proceeding. And we would propose to help implement the Division 23 choices by elevating that to 160 acres where there's for sites where county has not established areas, and then making that even larger at 240 acres where there are actually areas established. And again, having the benefit of that community type conversation and more robust participation. 240 acres, as you probably heard ad nauseum, right? For this category of land, that's the tipping point. Above 240, and you're leaving county jurisdiction and entering FSEC jurisdiction. So that was the reason for those sizes. Mark.
I think, John, my thing with the changing the acreages is because I'm not personally involved in the permitting nor review process of applications currently underway, right? I have a hard time understanding where acreage could be an affect in the potential for conflict with the surrounding land uses. And so I would be interested to know about any examples of when in the conditional use process there was a central conflict developed to kind of better understand how this interacts. Does that make sense?
Kind of. Yeah, and I'm looking to see if anybody else is.
Well, Damien's
Yeah,
on.
Damien came
And
off.
Max.
Damien came off mute.
I can speak to that a little. I think the primary place where acreage actually it makes sense in my mind might be an indicator is around like habitat and that type of thing.
Right.
But I think, Mark, the sort of fundamental is, put a fence around the project, and on the other side of the perimeter fence, you can keep doing whatever it is, whether it's farming or whatever, is happening. You get a big enough project, and if it doesn't have corridors through it, like, mule deer have to go around it because of the same fence, right? But I think that's kind of the impact profile. So external impacts, on the other side of the fence is really not a lot. I mean, you can talk about visibility impacts, right? Like you can see it, right? But the traditional like impacts and limitations on what can be done on farm as far as adjacent farming or forestry, et cetera, there's not a lot.
That was my impression.
Yeah.
Well, what we have heard as concerns, I don't know if it has been borne out as, I'm not presenting them as facts, but we've heard concerns about, one, just the conversion of agricultural land to something else, some other use. And then also a concern about complaints, creation of dust and other types of things that, common accepted agricultural practices do. So that's an example perhaps of, I'm not saying that's what happens, but of what kind of concerns we have heard.
And that's because that's what I've heard too, is the dust generation on adjacent lands being a potential conflict.
Right. Now we've also got, for all conditional uses, including this, where there's technically, it's presumably, there's a right to farm law in Oregon that's abided by. So you can't, anyway, you guys know more about that than I do probably. And Commissioner Bennett has his hand up.
Oh,
I think you just grabbed it, John. Most all the Eastern Oregon counties require them to accept a right to farm sign off. So they may, and they probably certainly will come in and crab about the dust, but uh, in Baker County, we've had a lot of experience with that, and it's kind of too bad, so sad. That was that was here first. So that's it. I think once again, my concern always is the cumulative impact. Obviously, taking a parcel out isn't going to be, but after a while, then we start seeing it for the wildlife, uh, for just agricultural use, and that's where we seem to have the conflict.
I'd
Okay.
just point out that right to farm it, there's an actual requirement in this division.
Right.
It says conditional approval gets conditioned on execution of a waiver that gets recorded.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's all definitely required.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, so like I said, this is where we've been at for a little while now in terms of how this could look, and maybe it's reasonable. So again, for high value, and we don't think there's going to be much high value farmland. I mean, maybe based on the irrigation that is regulated off or something, but not too much. But we wanted to make sure it was accounted for, right? So that would be the larger sizes. Let's go ahead and go down to non-arable land. And yeah, you'll see there. So what we're going by here is all the stuff that applies to high value farmland, right? This is specific to high value farmland. We'll come back and talk a little bit more about that. Why don't we go ahead and go down? We're just passing the study area, Commissioner Bennett, which it is attempts to get out of cumulative impact test. We'll talk more about that. For arable lands, those lands that are cultivated, but not considered high value, cultivated or cultivatable, that can be farmed, actively farmed. The test is, or the threshold currently is 20 acres. Your 20-acre site project through conditional use proceeding, and we again elevate that for the Division 23 items to 1280 or 2560, and again, those are based on the thresholds that have been and are in ORS 215-446, and the 1260 size. And Max, I see your hand up, but I'll tie this off real quick. Is the point above which FSEC jurisdiction becomes applicable? Again, leaving county jurisdiction and going to FSEC. So you'll see that similarities and approaches there, and we'll see that same sort of cadence when we get to non-arable in a second. Max, go ahead, bud.
So just trying to track between these thresholds and the standards in Division 195, what types of high value farmland would be potentially allowed for development as mitigated under the Division 195 rules?
So right now, we haven't chosen to offer this opportunity for lands within an irrigation district or lands within an AVA. Now, understanding that not all of those lands are created equally, but that's so far where we've been. I think that the difference could be with regards to a situation where there's a pertinent water right that is outside an irrigation district, and where that has been compromised somehow or regulated off, and we don't want the property owner that can't irrigate it anymore to be continued to be treated as irrigated land. Those are still, I think it would still qualify technically as high value under the ORS 195-300 sub 10 definition, but it would be eligible for a larger threshold. So again, that's a pretty small subsection or subcategory of that profile.
Yeah, and that raises another thing I've been chewing on, John, which is like if you're under 195 and you meet that appurtenant water rights section, but the property is still considered high value for some other reason, then it's still out, right? So it has to be that the only reason it is high value is because it has an appurtenant water right based on the irrigated capability class.
I think that's right, Max. So as you know, we have some lands that are class 2, irrigated or non-irrigated. We have a lot of soils that may be class 3 and prime if irrigated, but are class 4 or worse if non-irrigated. We have some lands that are class 4 if irrigated that would be considered high value based on the presence of that irrigation. So for instance, if you lost irrigation rights, but you're still considered class 2 prime or unique soils, then you're still excluded. You're still not eligible.
Right. So like you said, there are probably going to be very limited circumstances where that threshold for high value actually changes, because it's likely that the land is going to qualify as high value under one of the other 20.
I don't know. I mean, I think it depends, so, a lot of the area in Morrow County, frankly, around around Dugan's project, the Sunstone project, a lot of those lands, if you're, again, I'm mixing and matching a little bit because the AVA stuff comes into play there, but a lot of those lands are, if irrigated, I think considered class 3 and prime, and therefore high value. But if they're not irrigated, they might be class 3 but not prime, or they may be class 4. So without the presence of water, then they wouldn't fall into one of those higher categories of soil conditions. And Andrea, I probably should let Jamie do this. That's why Andrea's hand come up and do
doing my
Yeah,
job,
I just want to keep the focus on this isn't whether or not you're allowed to develop solar on that property. It's whether or not we're going to speed up the process. So I think that's a really key distinction, is that it doesn't mean that that land's out. I mean, to my chagrin, right? It doesn't mean that that land's out. It just means we're not going to speed up the process for it. So I keep hearing we're not allowed to do it there, and it's like, no, that's just, we're not going to speed up the process.
How many permits have been granted, John, on high value farmland?
Well, I don't have that number at the tip of my fingers. There was that flurry of conditional use stuff in the northern Willamette Valley. Outside of that, I mean, I know that there's some QF projects in Idaho Power Territory in the Treasure Valley of Mount Hood County. Those are exceptions. Maybe some others, but probably not a gigantic amount. All right, I think I can confidently say not a gigantic amount, but there has been a few. The answer is not 0, but it's not, it's probably not 20 either. In Eastern Oregon, the difference is different in a little bit different in Western Oregon.
Andrea, I see that you're still unmuted. Was there anything more you wanted to share?
No, sorry.
Okay. Dugan, go ahead.
I just wanted to kind of take up on what John was saying, and agree with Andrea. It is about what we're prioritizing. I can just say from our perspective on our project, it does fit in this kind of unique situation. If you look at that Morrow County map, you can see that under these rules, certainly a project of our size, but even if you had a much smaller project that would fit under these rules in that area, it would not be allowed to go through this expedited process. And that's due to the fact that we are both within, or maybe putting the AVA, we are within the AVA, which does classify a good amount of our land as high value on that project. But also there is a water right, despite being in a critical water area. And you're exactly right, John. When it's irrigated, it's considered prime, but when it's not, it's mostly class 4. So, definitely a much lower class level on the actual land when you consider that it's not that feasible. And I think as people know, and if you were on the Morrow County tour with us, we drove by that site. It's all dry land wheat. And, we recently received our FSEC permit. That was a, 2-year process. So definitely not, definitely not expedited. And we did end up doing a mitigation on that project, which is similar to what is contemplated in these rules. And so certainly a size that doesn't really fit within the county process or within these rules. But, just to be clear, like even if we were at a smaller size, I don't think that project would be allowed, even with the mitigation it is doing, despite FSEC deeming it okay to get an exception. So, maybe we don't want to speed projects like that up, but that's, we are just want to kind of point the realities of that specific example so people can start thinking about that.
Yeah, thank you, Dugan. And I remember we were fortunate enough to have the landowner, or one of the landowners, Mr. Grebe, I believe. And he said, we'll never get our water, we'll never irrigate this again. I mean, I recall that was his perspective, but I think from his standpoint, the farmers, they'd never be able to irrigate that property again.
So the question on the table that people are kind of clarifying more than weighing in on is, do these acreage thresholds as proposed in the language make sense?
Yeah, maybe what folks are kind of, thank you, Dan. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks, Dan.
This morning. Maybe what folks are kind of chewing on that, maybe we can go down to the non-arable stuff and look at how kind of that's organized. Yep, keep going, please. Keep going, please. Right here. So again, you'll see the same sort of cadence, 320s, the conditional use threshold. We've suggested 1920 for sites, and then we've been left it, as you see on lines 12 and 13, we've said it's not limited. There's no limitation for non-arable lands when a county has designated an area. And we're really interested to see what folks may think about that. If that's not important or that it felt not necessary, that's fine. We'll change it. But for at least for purpose of conversation, I felt obligated to call that out.
I just had a couple questions, and this is a bit thinking out loud, but looking at, we have different thresholds for sites versus if counties have designated areas. And I'm curious if others have thought through what sort of incentives or disincentives does that provide for a county choosing to do the areas process, or just other ripple effects of those thresholds being different. So I'm not asking that from I think it should be one way or the other perspective, but just looking to unpack what the implications of those being different could be. And then similarly with the thresholds matching FSEC's thresholds everywhere except for the non-arable, is there an intention there that I don't know if we resolved does this apply to FSEC projects or not question, or is that choice trying to provide some clarity, like for the high value and the arable lands, it's basically sort of saying this doesn't apply once you get above that county threshold, and so therefore does it not apply at FSEC, or is it just like these are the numbers that we have and so we're going to use them?
John?
I think it's some of both. We have been exploring the relationship with the FSEC project. FSEC will apply rules that are intact to protect farmland. I think that where those rules, which we're looking at right now, those rules specify an acreage threshold, that something going beyond that's identified in the rules would likely trigger their exception process, which is different. It's in statute, not in our rules. It's in their statute. But that, where LCDC's rules promulgated for the purpose of protecting farmland do not have an acreage threshold, and I'm flying a little blind here, but where they do not have an acreage threshold, as seen in lines 12 and 13, I don't know that FSEC or Department of Energy would believe there's a necessity to require an exception. There's no indicator that says above this size you're not consistent with goal 3 in that circumstance. So, and there are people on this call that have a lot more experience with FSEC proceedings and have thought much more about that in the intersection than I have. So I certainly invite their thoughts, but I think that it's a little bit of both.
Anybody want to weigh in on helping Laura answer those questions? So there were two parts there. One part was around, are there implications for having different thresholds for sites versus areas? And the other one has to do with similarity with the FSEC thresholds. Dugan, I was hoping you'd raise your hand.
Well, I mean, I guess I'll let John. I'd like to prompt John to re-explain why we're separating the two. And then the second one is, I mean, technically any project can go to FSEC, right? It's the option of the developer to go to FSEC. So someone could go to FSEC with 1,000-acre project on arable land, and these rules might apply because they use, FSEC does relate back to the LCDC rules. So even if there are projects below the clipping standard for what is automatically thrown at FSEC, there could be scenarios where a developer decides to go to FSEC and would utilize these rules. So I'll make that clear. And someone, if you're a lawyer and you disagree with that interpretation, you can tell me that I'm wrong. But yeah, I don't know, I guess kind of further on that. I think I'm trying to think through the incentives. I mean, certainly an incentive of the larger one would be a developer maybe helping, potentially offering support to let a county kind of go through the larger process, if they want to seek a larger size, and that might come in, often developers will help counties, especially kind of in the early days of this, developers would come in and help counties write their rules and help staff out with coming up with some of those standards. And that might be the case here too, with helping with staff time and making sure that they could actually go through the opt-in county level process because of the potential benefit of a larger size being allowed under that. That's the first thing that comes to mind for me.
So we have been thinking, in response to the question about why two different sizes, right? We're committed and have been committed to furnishing larger project sizes without an exception, right? So that's a done deal. That's going to happen. What those sizes are there's a discussion. They're not cemented. And we had thought, we're talking about some pretty, especially as we get into these lower quality, other than arable or not or high value farmland, especially in the non-arable soils, and even in arable too. They're pretty big. These are pretty big projects, right? And so we just felt like it could make sense and be reasonable that in advance of being authorized these really quite large projects, that there'd be more of a community conversation, and hopefully that would lead to additional community acceptance and support for these types of projects. And then, as you said, kind of to sweeten the deal a little bit. That's probably the wrong way to put it, but they could consider even larger projects up to what would trigger an FSEC review. So that's really, we're trying to come up with a situation where things don't land too hard at the local level, without having a chance to really get a sense, an idea of what the county citizens in these neighborhoods would feel is okay, right? We're kind of splitting the balance, or splitting the difference a little bit. Anyway, I'll just stop there and say that's kind of what we have been thinking about in terms of why it would be different sizes.
So other questions that people have, or thoughts? We're trying to, this is our time to understand what's being proposed here and offer any other suggestions. Damien?
Yeah, I think just kind of combining a couple things, I don't think that there's a whole lot of legal significance to the particular acreage thresholds, and tying those to the FSEC statute, can opt into or out of FSEC. The goal exception threshold as far as acreage is whatever is the same at both FSEC and the local proceedings. So I think these are, the difficulty is always like, is a number big? Is the number small? Is it bigger than a different number? But it's hard to come up with like saying what is the right number. So there's something to hang our hat on, and are larger than the numbers used to be. So that's good. I'm not sure that I follow that there's a meaningful reason to have two acreage thresholds for, what at like a high level are, just areas that are determined to be good for solar. I get there's more public process associated with one, but I think it comes out in the wash. I would prefer, I think, we just put the acreage limitations, set them at the higher level, and give counties some amount of flexibility if they want to go through a fulsome process and make them bigger. Okay, that type of thing. But yeah,
Are you saying that you would, I mean, it doesn't sound like you have, a strong opinion one way or another, but you're suggesting maybe just have the site and area thresholds be the same, but higher, at the higher
yeah,
level?
and then make the area threshold something that the counties have discretion to make bigger if they want to. If they go through an entire goal 5 inventory process and do the whole thing, or the as defined in this particular in that section of division 23, that they go through that and they create the area and they want to have a bigger threshold. Okay, but yeah, I don't know that it's gonna, having a higher threshold for area is going to incentivize people to do more or prevent any kind of impact until after public input. That's all very kind of hard, difficult to quantify, and we're kind of based on like one number, just sort of the framing of a number is bigger than a number and how that makes people kind of feel. But that is always a big part of this, even though.
Well, we've got 3 other questions to get through for 33. I don't know that we have closure on this, on these 2 questions, John, other than not a lot of folks are weighing in, and
yeah, it feels like people probably want to think about it.
people are sort of kicking around, what
which is
numbers
fair.
make sense, and
so that's maybe that's what we do for. I mean, hopefully, explained it in a way that at least if you don't agree with it, you understand kind of what we're trying to get at.
Yeah.
And where these numbers kind of came from. And
yeah.
and so forth, so on and so forth. But
So-
Damien's suggestion.
Which is this having the same number for sites and areas and giving and then counties can increase the area size if they want to go through a goal 5, I think is what Damien's suggesting.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think that opportunity is available now. But you know, if we want to restructure it or I'm just plain wrong, we can certainly take a look at that. But yeah, we probably, you know, I think we've you know, hopefully again kind of described sort of our thinking there, and you know, such that we can,
Yeah.
you know, probably make a determination now when we come back together in January.
So let's move on to question 4, which is the cumulative impacts piece. And I'm sorry
Yeah.
that Andrew's not here because you know, he's the guy that's really been carrying this flag.
Right, and so let's go ahead. We're going to go back up. Actually, we're going to go back up quite a ways because there's two right there. Actually, I'm sorry, right there, a little further down, right in there. Okay, so there are two distinct pieces here. One applies to high value farmland areas, and the other, which we'll see in a second, applies to arable lands. There is no existing study area / cumulative impact analysis required on non-arable lands, and that was on purpose. You know, when the commission established these rules originally, you know, they wanted to provide some motivation, incentive to look at lands that were the least productive for agricultural purposes and wildlife purposes. And so they, you know, didn't apply all the things there. These, you know, the concept here, which we've broadened in Western Oregon, of the existing study area, it's a mile on high value farm. It's a mile from the subject property, and it's 48 acres are constructed or have received land use approvals and obtained building permits, and we've expanded that. I think it's proportional, 2.5 miles for high value farmland, 300 acres of project built or otherwise committed. Let me go down a little bit. So yeah, right there. That's just right. So the top part of that page, you know, really talks about what that trigger would obligate a county to do. They would consider and make a determination that the new project one under consideration will not materially alter the stability of the overall land use pattern, which is a term that is most commonly used in non-farm dwelling proceedings. We felt it was, and others felt it was I think it was a little bit of a known quantity, and have offered some examples of when that might happen. It doesn't prescribe an outcome. You know, a county would need to consider it only if the circumstances trigger it, and they would have the discretion to figure out what it means. Let's go ahead and go down a little bit. A little bit further. A little bit further. A little bit further. Right in here. So as you'll see, here's basically the same test, the same study area / cumulative impact assessment for arable lands, and it's larger. The study area is larger. And again, I think that the amount of acreage should be proportional, and then it's, you know, it's basically the same test when there's that amount of development on the ground or permitted, you know, with building permits. Then you look at it and consider how to make a determination on that front. That has been the attempt. I don't know if it's ever been used. Honestly, I don't know if there's ever been enough development present within a study area to trigger it. But that has been, yeah, Damien, right. That's what I thought. But that has been our attempt to come up with something resembling a cumulative impacts assessment or test. And so we thought we would put it for consideration here. And we heard at least one member say last time, I don't think Judge McCarthy's here, he didn't think that was a good fit for this sort of an arrangement. That being carrying out the pathway in Division 23. We heard from others at different times, different places that cumulative impacts are pretty important in their feeling. So again, this is an attempt. It's based on existing requirements. We've touched it up a little bit, make it more Eastern Oregon centric, so to speak. It would apply to high value farmland and arable land. It would not apply, does not currently apply to non-arable land, the lowest quality. So we wanted to make sure that was, we raised that and described it and even discussed it if we had a chance to do so. So I'll just stop there, Jamie. That's
Yeah,
my,
let's say John's paused. So an opportunity to step in.
I can add just a little bit because I don't believe that is on any longer for us, and I apologize or that might be on. I was not able to make the last one where Mike made comments. However, cumulative impact is very important to us in terms of what that does for remaining industry and the viability of continued farms that are seeking to continue active agricultural practices.
Thanks, Amanda, for weighing in on that. Other thoughts, Max?
So John, this applies to every facility, not just facilities that are authorized under Division 195.
as written it does, Max.
And in addition to all the additional standards under subsection O related to wildfire,
Yes.
soil compaction, et cetera.
Yeah, I think we can choose to isolate them to the Division 23 pieces. Now, if we did that with the study area, the other, the existing stuff would continue to apply. But it could be, I think it is the choice of the RAC. If the RAC wanted to say, let's just apply these to the Division 23 195, then that's certainly. That's not how it's written now, but it could be if that's where the RAC wanted to go.
Yeah, I think that'd probably be my preference at this point in time. I think my comfort with this depends on whether we think the 195 rule is going to result in anything meaningful, and I'm not sure that we're there yet. So on the one hand, to have a draft rule where the maps don't look great, and we haven't talked a lot about what trade-offs the RAC is willing to make, and then on the same end, increasing the permitting burden for all facilities when it's not clear that there's going to be facilities that can qualify for the fast track doesn't seem like the right balance to me, but that's where I'm at with this.
Thanks, Max. Dugan?
I'll just quickly jump in and say, yeah, I agree. I mean, I do want to keep this rule as much as it can be to the idea of the fast track. And even if it is reasonable for us to think about a cumulative impact standard on a larger scale, I honestly don't know if it's the place of this RAC to be implementing that. So I would be more comfortable if it was limited to, again, least conflict, low conflict within this section, right? And I'm a little bit worried about this going up to the FSEC level, because I don't know if that's necessarily our place.
Others?
Tom here.
Hi, Tom.
So I just wanted to mention that from an FSIC standpoint, literally one of our things that we have applicants do is submit all of the applicable, LCDC rules that would apply to an FSEC project. So it is part of our standard process to apply
any rules or regulations that are applicable. So we did sort of a preliminary review on the rules and to see, potential impacts and overlaps. Didn't really see anything that concerned us at all. Obviously, we're continuing to make changes. This was based on the notice proposed rulemaking version, but it's certainly within. I don't know if it's within the purview of this rulemaking, and I'm not going to speak to that. But in terms of LCDC's authority, I mean, they can certainly make changes to their rules that would impact the FSEC citing process to the extent that the council is looking at whether the project implements LCDC regulations. So I don't know if I'm clear here. I'm just trying to make the point that it would be appropriate to make changes that would impact the FSEC process because all the other rules they've made that would impact our process are totally legitimate.
Damien? Thanks, Tom, for that.
Yeah, I just, want to point out a couple things as far as context. It's definitely difficult to pin down kind of cumulative impact standards, right? So if you read the actual requirement section Romanet II or whatever, that like what does that actually mean? Very loose, very squishy, uncertain. From a development standpoint, that means that you could justify kind of any answer. There's not really like an clear evidentiary standard that you could say that, it's like the land use pattern of the quote unquote area and things like that. So these are the type of standards that, we really like to avoid. That being said, and it's difficult because it's, there's not an actual example of, solar being responsible for a bunch of cumulative impacts that have put a bunch of farmers out of business, right? Like that just hasn't happened. This is a worry. So we're trying to get out in front of that worry, I think, is the idea. It's happened, with other uses and different things like that, but it's so it's hard to say kind of just multiplying the west side of the state standard and making a bigger circle. What does that actually mean? I don't know. It's definitely more work to figure out everything that's going on and been permitted in a much bigger area. Because the practical impact of this is that every application that comes in, you got to say my project is here and here's a 5 mile radius and here's, some analysis of every single thing that's been permitted or proposed or built on the solar side within this now much larger circle. So, that being said, it's never been triggered and we've never had cumulative impacts actually doing a disservice from solar to a farming area. So it's all pretty speculative. So I don't know that I have a better number, but I would lean in the way of less kind of make work on the front end and these are the type of standards that folks end up fighting about a lot. Like, what do they mean? Can they be enforced, etc.?
Commissioner Bennett needs to leave to go feed his cattle. Thanks for joining us, Mark. And
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner.
Merry Christmas and Happy New Year to you as well. So,
Could Brandon weigh in on this?
Brandon, I think, stepped away because it's a county court.
Oh, okay.
A county court. No, he's still showing that he's here. Brandon, are you with us still? I think he was showing as listening. but he had to step away because of county court business. Where do we go on this?
So it feels like, Jamie, there's a couple different perspectives, right, that have been offered. And I guess I also want to emphasize that, if the RAC declines to do something on this front at all, the substitute would be, and would come back as what's already existing. There is an existing requirement. It's just different. It's just smaller. So it's not like we just get away from this altogether, unless the RAC wanted to say, hold these projects harmless from this test. I think we've heard that's not what some folks would care to do at all. And so maybe a middle ground, so to speak, would be that this language or something like it applies specifically to the Division 230195 pathway, and doesn't apply to the typical conditional use applications that would continue to be status quo. We kind of heard a couple different things, but that might be something for folks to chew on, think about, and come back ready to offer a position.
So, John, I just want to clarify what you just said is that right now the study areas that are written in this draft is only applying to Western Oregon apply across the board?
So that's correct. So right. So you'll see, if you look somewhere, it says, for example, on line 17, if in Western Oregon fewer than 80 acres, that is existing language. It only doesn't say if in Western Oregon. It says if fewer than 80 acres. That applies across the board on both sides of the state in these particular land categories: high value and arable.
By Damien.
Thank you, Damien.
Mike?
I do think it is important to have an evaluation of cumulative impacts. But I appreciate that if we don't have real standards for doing that, it can be an opportunity for argumentation and legal challenges. So I'm feeling kind of mixed on this. I mean, I do think it's important for that larger view to look at what those potential impacts might be, and without looking at a larger footprint and a larger area, you don't do that necessarily. You don't do that systematically. So I'm generally in favor of it, but I'm sensitive to the fact that it's maybe difficult to implement.
Thanks, Mike. And Brandon, you're actually back just in time. We're just winding down this conversation, struggling a little bit around it's question 4 on page 12 about the cumulative impacts study area size. And Mike had wondered what your thoughts were on this while you were away, but now you're back. So I don't know if you have thoughts to weigh in on.
So I don't, I'm trying to wrap my head around.
I understand. I'm just caught you cold. I know. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it has to do with the cumulative impacts study area size. You can see here what's proposed is in Eastern Oregon, the study area would include lands located within 5 miles. And the concerns are the concern is that for folks that would like to see this, they want the rule to address in some way, looking at cumulative impacts in a larger area that makes sense, for Eastern Oregon. And then for folks that are looking at it on the other side, they're concerned about additional, just additional process, how you do this. There hasn't been precedent to show that these kinds of developments have had negative cumulative impacts on agriculture. So that's kind of where we were at.
Sure. My reaction, just based on my own experience as the planning director in this jurisdiction, we have 5 permitted sites. 2 of them are fully built and active at the moment. And it also goes to within reason that, I'll touch on that again. When you look at cumulative impacts from a local perspective so far, I think a lot of this comes into play when also considering power distribution and where these are actually going to go, right? We have a finite area where these can go based on where the power infrastructure is. And so if we're looking at implementing a familiar process, such as the 2,000 acre study area that has been utilized for other types of decisions, say dwellings not in conjunction with farm use, for instance, or any farm impacts analysis, it wouldn't be totally unfamiliar to counties to implement something like that. I think the question is it really necessary? And apologies if I'm coming in late and this is retread, but I'm not entirely sure based on, and again, I don't work for other jurisdictions, I work for Harney County, but I'm not sure that's something that would seem like a step that would make a lot of sense in my jurisdiction, just based on the limited area in which these can actually be feasible. But then again, other jurisdictions may see that differently. So,
yeah, well, and I think we were hearing from like the jurisdictions with wheat farmers, they're feeling differently. So.
Yeah, I wish I had a little bit more better perspective or information to provide there. I'm not sure I'm totally one way or the other. Implementing a cumulative impacts analysis of, say, a 2,000 acre study area, if you will, I'm not sure that would improve would help make decisions better or worse in Harney County.
Mm-hmm.
I don't lean either way with it. I'm not sure there are enough opportunities based on our power profile, for one, for that to be a necessity for us.
Yeah. Okay. So, Mike, your hand went up, and then
yeah, I was thinking, in addition to evaluating, potential economic impact on agriculture or other economic activities. I'm just thinking that, in Wallowa County, potentially people might be more concerned with visual impact, cumulative visual impact of solar projects. And I don't know if that is within the evaluation standards to consider visual impacts, but I think that could be something that some folks in Wallowa County might be concerned about. They're okay with a few projects within an area, but to have a 5 mile radius completely filled with solar panels, that might have just too much of a visual impact on our scenic county.
If I may, in regards to visual impacts, I have found in the nearly 18 years that I've been working for Harney County that is county by county is a very subjective standard. And so I would suggest that there are going to be different views on what visual impacts mean to different communities, and that may be better addressed community by community in their own ordinances.
Yeah. Amanda?
Yeah, so Brandon, I don't think you were on when we added brief comment here. The concern in the cumulative impacts are more into counties that have a significant concentration on wheat grounds. So what we are seeing there is, among all of the projects, the opportunities for viability of ongoing farm operations for active producers that are actively looking to continue farming outside of these projects. So that is the reason for looking to retain it. I know it's a different situation for Harney, but in terms of where these are being looked at, it is highly concentrated on wheat grounds, and that has an impact to viability.
I'm in no position to argue against that. This is hay and cattle country over here. So, when I look at the work that, from my perspective, when I look at the work on this project overall, I think it is, how can we touch on things that make the most sense for all the counties involved? And in areas where wheat farming is more prominent, I think it makes sense for those communities to consider maybe implementing their own 2,000 acre study area. I'm not so sure that would be the case necessarily. I can't speak for Mal here or especially Lake, but in southeastern Oregon, you may not have that potential there. So I'd just be mindful of implementing a measure on these that is meant to be more specific to other types of areas. And I could be wrong. There could be other crops and things that I'm not considering too, but just my 2 cents.
Thanks, Brandon. Gordon?
Say, based on Brandon's comments, it might be something where the rule would eventually have a fairly low standard, maybe the existing standard, but explicitly allow a county to expand that based upon the circumstances in that county. And that way we have a very small, a base standard, if you will, but a specific allowance that counties can go higher if they believe the circumstances as part of an individualized program. Once again, that they adopted wanted to go higher, they would be explicitly allowed to do that, which I think could happen anyway as we're putting the rules together. But I think making that very clear would be perhaps a good way. And that way, circumstances in Sherman County, which are quite different from Harney County, would be reflected with the Sherman County program versus the Harney County program.
So thanks for that, Gordon. So we've got 20 minutes left in our time. We've got 3 more questions related to section 33. Much of, we haven't talked about 23 today because we've spent nearly all of our meetings talking about 23. And we have just a few things to highlight in there. But it feels like it's important to get through these final questions for 33. So let's do that.
Yeah, thanks you guys. Thanks for this, this healthy conversation. The final few questions, I'm looking at 5. And again, I think 7 hopefully is kind of settled based on the forest conversation. But 5, as we talked about, there's certain things that the commission can do and certain things they can't do. And the way these uses are positioned in the statute requires application of these farm and forest compatibility tests, ORS 215-296, which is also included in division 33-0130 sub 5. And it can be complicated and it can be complex. So one of the things we've talked about doing is, so while the commission cannot remove it, they can interpret what that means or should mean with regard to certain uses. And so we've kind of taken a run at doing that. Let's go ahead and go down. Let's go down almost to the bottom. No, let's keep going down. Keep going down. Right here. Oh, so above, just a little bit up right there. So lines 18 through 26, make an attempt to provide a more straightforward way to demonstrate compliance with this otherwise very discretionary rule and statute that require a lot of judgment. And so we have said here, and with regards to if you line it all up, what it would say is that non-arable lands where photovoltaic solar resource areas have been established. This test, as we talked about, identify here, will be satisfied by meeting the provisions, which we'll look at here momentarily, the siting standards, general siting standards, and also any compensatory mitigation for agricultural lands required of Division 23, if any. You do those things, then you're deemed compliant with that farm and forest compatibility criteria. So that's right. I think that's pretty much it on that. Does this make sense? Or would there a different way to skin the cat, or should we apply that farm and forest compatibility test as written and very recently updated across the board as it now exists in the other rules? So that's a question.
You asked the question and nobody raised their hand.
So yeah, while people are thinking about it a little bit, maybe that's just what it requires. So we're sensitive, we're sensitive, and we just as soon try to not, configure a situation where Division 23 says this is a really desirable spot for photovoltaic solar development, and then find that local opposition or something could utilize another area of the law that applies in this discretionary criteria to oppose or try to block a would otherwise be a legitimate solar development. That's really what it comes down to. We're trying to provide a more straightforward path. We can't remove it. We can't remove the test. The legislature could, but we can't. But come up with a more straightforward way to approach it that makes it much more of a discretionary type thing than much more clear and objective. Sorry, I got it reversed. More clear and objective and less discretionary.
Some thoughts on this?
Well, folks are kind of thinking about it. Maybe we just move up a little
Yeah.
bit. We're kind of segue into the question 6 piece.
Yeah.
And scroll can go up, right there. So okay, Mike.
Yeah, I see what Mike said.
I did. So let's go through this real quickly, and then we'll end up right back there because this is part of these standards. So the first 4 of these are present and apply on both Western and Eastern Oregon to high value farmland and arable lands, and you see they're talking about negative impacts to agricultural operations. That's on the subject property. And then B speaks to, oh, thank you, Greg. Happy holidays. B speaks to unnecessary soil erosion. C speaks to unnecessary soil compaction. And D talks about unabated introduction or spread of noxious weeds or weeds. All of these can be satisfied through providing a report or a study that describes, how they'll be avoided. If we go ahead and go down a little bit. Let me go ahead and scroll down to the next page. Okay, so starting at E right there, these next three would be new, and as written would apply to all uses or all proposals, regardless of the pathway. And we've talked about maybe we just limit it to this Division 23 stuff. E would be the soil health. Talk about soil health, which is really an attempt to avoid a bare earth situation that's accomplished through through 2,4-D or Roundup or whatever application. And F is wildfire. We've heard in different circumstances a lot about concerns about wildfire. And then the final one at G is about workforce housing. And again, all of these, I like to refer to them more as standards because there's a kind of a identified way to address them. If you have the data or the information prepared by someone who knows what they're doing, then that can constitute the evidence that you need without really thinking too much more about it at the county level. And then finally, that gets us back down to H, which is what we talked about a moment ago. And also just point out that for non-arable lands, the lowest quality farm and ranch lands, we only apply, we do not apply the first three. We apply the weeds test applies, and then these last three, soil health, housing, and fire would apply to. So here's I'll try to get at this, Mike. The existing statute, which this refers to, it applies to all conditional uses, including energy production. Says that the use may be allowed only where a local governing body or its designee finds that the use will not A, force a significant change in accepted farm or forest practices on surrounding lands devoted to farm or forest use, or B, significantly increase the cost of accepted farm or forest practices on surrounding lands devoted to farm or forest use. That's the language in the statute. Now that's been augmented by case law, which provides some description about what can and can't happen. And then there's been an effort more recently at the department to codify some of that case law as well as add some other items. And the point is simply that can be a very discretionary criteria. It can be one that can be hard to satisfy, and it can be one that folks that aren't supportive of a project can really seize on with the attempt to keep the project from happening. And so rather than that, going through that very discretionary, very judgmental process, we're saying maybe in some circumstances, we're going to interpret what that can mean for solar, and what it means is something much straightforward and more clear and objective. And so it's much more apparent when the test has been satisfied. It's easier to demonstrate that you've done it.
Dugan?
Hey, y'all, sorry, I'm on the move, so I don't know if you can hear me. I'll just say, I mean, to my previous point, I really don't like the idea of us, even if it's limited to Eastern Oregon, kind of coming up with new, larger rules. I get, John, what you're trying to say here is that maybe counties would exempt the places we're picking, the special places, the low conflict places might not have to meet these rules, but they're new rules. And I just think it goes against the even if it's well intentioned, I do think it's adding more barriers for solar generally, or adding more analysis than we already have, which at least in my opinion, is a very regular process that we already go through. Kind of, I don't know if this is necessarily the EC analysis, but whatever, this kind of soil, all the things we normally do. And so I guess I would state that I'm against adding any provisions, even if the good projects that we're picking in this fast lane process can maybe get out of them. I'm just kind of against adding those in at this point. I think
these considerations are often talked about in any application. Certainly it's talked about on the FSEC level. I can tell you that with our recent project, we went through workforce housing, we went through bare earth, wildfire. Those things also conflict at times, right? For
Right.
wildfire concerns, sometimes you'd like to have bare earth as compared to having vegetation. We heard that out in the Morrow kind of meeting with the sheep farmer out there about what's the right mix of not too high of vegetation underground to expose yourself to wildfire risk, but still having something to hold dust in. And so I just think it's complicated, and I really don't want these discretionary things to be added into all projects. And especially when we're trying to come up with more objective, straightforward standards for the good projects that we're trying to get through this process. So hopefully I was clear on that, but that's just where I stand at this point.
Thank you, Dugan.
Yeah, thanks, Dugan. It's really clear. Anybody else want to weigh in on this question? This will probably be our last question we can deal with today. Mike?
Just responding to Dugan's concerns. I think that these are all reasonable requirements for analysis. I mean, I think I would hope that any project would be looking at these, and if they're not specified, Dugan, it sounds like you're saying that they're going to be done anyway. I'm not entirely clear on that, but I would like to see a guarantee that these elements are considered and evaluated, and if they are, then you could consider those requirements being met. But you're saying, I think, Dugan, you were saying that these things are going to be evaluated anyway, regardless of whether they're required here or not.
I think certainly they will be evaluated in any kind of discretionary approval. These are big things that you would consider. But I do think, it's definitely something that beyond that, I just don't know my background is. I'm sorry, I don't know if it's the role of this group because of the charge that we're given to add new rules to all solar projects cities can.
I see what you're saying. And sounds like, Max, go ahead, and maybe there's something you can help underscore this.
Yeah, I mean, my feeling on these standards is the same as the cumulative impact stuff. Like, I think industry's comfort with adding more burdensome permitting requirements across the board is going to be based on entirely and on whether or not the Division 195 rules have an impact. And I think that's still unclear. And I agree with Dugan that it's somewhat outside the scope of the legislation. But I think there's more conversation that needs to be had on these standards.
Amanda?
So understanding, Dugan, your comments and looking at it as how we define low conflict also looks at some of these reasonable aspects. And so not being overly burdensome, but I think at least the way I'm looking at these, most of these would be reasonable to look at for a project. And as we consider projects that would be within that definition of low conflict, part of working that in is going through these issues that would address community concerns.
Thanks, Amanda. That's similar to what Mike was saying. It's just like, well, there's some assurances or certainty, it sounds like, that on the community side that they're looking for, that these things will be evaluated. And Dugan had said that these are things that the solar community looks at anyway. But I think that there was just this question about kind of assurances that these things are looked at.
Yeah,
So,
and if I could briefly add, I think that if that is the concern, and maybe this is something reasonable to add into the special good lower conflict, I just think this is flipped right now. This is saying everyone is applied to this, but if you're in the special area, it maybe doesn't apply to you. So maybe we need to flip this. So it's like these kind of extra points of emphasis, double checking that people are thinking through wildfire, soils, and ground cover, and workforce housing. Those should be applied to the special projects to double check that they're the best, rather than applied to everything and then exempting the special projects.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe I'm reading it the wrong way, but this might be flipped from what we actually want to be doing here.
Yeah, Dugan, I think that that's a great observation. Max added something in the chat that I don't know if you can see. Max says if these are tied directly to 195 projects, that seems to be what folks are asking for. John, I saw you come off mute for just a minute. Were you gonna?
Well, I can say we could, yeah, if we can certainly take a crack at what that would look like, and if that's where the rack lands, then I think that we'll have. I don't think we're not going to settle it today, but I think there's been some good commentary on both sides, and if we can strike the balance, then we can we should try to do that. And yeah, there
Thanks,
we go.
Laura.
Thank you, Laura.
So John, it's 2 minutes to 1. And I think we talked about question 7 already. Right?
Well, we have, right, because it's basically the same.
It's basically
question,
the same.
language. It was in the fourth, right? It's about
Yeah.
predominant use and using which
Right.
standards to use. So I
Okay.
think
So here's where I think here's where we are. So we have 1 minute left. We've lost some people already. Our next meeting is January 9th. We've got 3 weeks pretty much between now and then. We didn't talk about Division 23 because we've been talking about 23 almost every meeting. And what you see in the memo that John and his team put together, that this is the memo that starts with draft rules for RAC consideration, and it has the Division 4, 6, 23, and 33. It's the pages 1 through 3. And it lists out sort of the key questions that we walked through today for 6, 4, and 33. And we've spent a lot of time on those because we haven't spent time on those before. And then for 23, it lists out line by line what revisions you're seeing. And there's nearly every question related to 23 is, hey, did we get this right? And so that's what we're looking for from all of you. So you've got 3 weeks to look at Division 23, look at the companion memo that lists out what the revisions are, and say, did we get this right? And if not, what would your suggestion be? Ideally, it would be great to hear those before the 9th, so that if you have questions about these, I think probably, John and Adam, what's your schedule look like Christmas week? Are you in?
well, the 25th is bad.
25th is
I should be around.
But yeah, I'll be out Christmas week, unfortunately.
Okay, so
I
Adam's
think,
out.
John, you're going to be Santa on that day.
I know. I'll be driving my sleigh.
Yeah, I think Christmas Eve is
Thank you,
good. Bye,
Max.
Max. So we've got 3 weeks to review. If you can get, most all of us are going to be working that week between Christmas and New Year's. So that would be a good time to pick up the phone, to talk to John, to talk to Adam, clarify questions that you have. The meeting on the 9th is really focused on, landing this to as close as a landing as we can. And so as much as we can resolve outstanding issues, we want to be able to do that. Mike?
Yeah, again, just because quite a few people have dropped off,
Yeah.
if you could pose those directions and questions again in another email, just so that people can really focus on what you're wanting, what you're asking for us to
That's exactly what
consider.
Andrea
That'd be
just put in the chat too. Yeah.
He said it much nicer.
I like what you wrote,
East coasted
Andrea.
us again.
She's just hearing words, blah, blah.
Hey.
Charlie Brown adults, wah, wah,
Right.
wah, wah, wah.
This
Okay,
was good. We didn't get through everything we wanted to, but we got through a lot of stuff we needed to get through. And this helps us a lot of staff. And yeah, thank you for your patience and your attention to this stuff. And just again to reiterate, we'll be having office hours, or if that doesn't work, but you want to talk, let us know. We'll set something up, and we're happy to do one-on-ones or anything that works. Just let us know.
yep, we'll do a follow-up email with more clear instructions. Okay, everybody.